The air hung thick, viscous almost, saturated with the dust of centuries, and the dry, sweetly sour scent of ancient parchment slowly surrendering to time. Tiny, golden motes swirled in the faint illumination, caught briefly by the ethereal glow before vanishing into shadow, stirred fitfully by the silent passage of servitor drones. These automatons, their flesh fused with cold metal, glided along well-worn grooves in the obsidian floor, their presence announced only by a deep, resonant hum that resonated through the bones of the library itself, a basso continuo beneath the silence. High above, shadows writhed and twisted across the vaulted ceiling, puppets dancing to the swaying luminescence of suspensor globes that drifted like captive stars. Their light, a fragile, dim gold, barely penetrated the profound gloom, washing over the endless canyons formed by rows upon rows of towering shelves. These monoliths groaned under the weight of history bound in leather and vellum, crumbling books threatening to crumble at a touch, iron-bound codices heavier with secrets than with metal, fragile scrolls precious enough to be cradled in suspensor clamps that hummed softly, preventing the very air from completing the work of decay. It was not merely a repository, but a tomb, holding the whispered soul of humankind's sprawling, brutal ascent. Millennia rested here, stratified, dense, and overwhelmingly forgotten, unknown to the teeming masses whose lives flowed on, oblivious, beyond these hallowed, oppressive walls. Hunched like a gnarled gargoyle over a broad slab of oak, its surface a battlefield map of scars, ink splatters, and the worn fingerprints of countless ghosts who had sat before, scribe Hieronymus Gale bent his aged frame. The scritch-scratch of his quill was the most insistent sound, a counterpoint to the deeper vibrations, its sharp nib periodically dipping into an inkwell containing thick, midnight fluid brewed from Terran soot and rare oils, releasing a sharp, acrid perfume that brazenly cut through the library's deeper olfactory tapestry of age and erosion. Faintly from within the cold, tomb-like marble walls, ghostly murmurs echoed the binary whispers of automated archivists communing with the slumbering cogitator stacks embedded deep within the stone, exchanging data in secrets only machines could comprehend. Gale paused, the quill trembling infinitesimally as he straightened, a groan escaping his thin lips as vertebrae protested. His gaze lifted, weary yet inevitably drawn upwards, tracing the intricate frescoes adorning the celestial vault. At the apex blazed the Emperor's visage, rendered in radiant gold and imperial crimson, radiating an almost palpable aura of stern, divine light. Around him, scenes unfolded in painstaking, terrible detail. Humanity's unending, brutal wars, their valiant sacrifices etched in scenes that curved across the dome, each panel a testament to desperate millennia, a chronicle in pigment and plaster of the blood-soaked path that carved the Imperium's dominion through the treacherous stars. This sanctum, heavy with the breath of time, was the Sanctum Historica, buried in the heart of Terra's Scholastica Psychona, a sacred vault for the scattered, fragmented memory of man. And it was here, amidst this silent congregation of the past, that Hieronymus Gale, one of the eldest chroniclers still enduring in the oppressive service of the Adeptus Administratum, a man whose own life was etched onto his face like faint palimpsest writing, had been summoned to an impossible labor. His task, to compile an encompassing summary, to distill the radiant colossus that was the Astra Militarum, the Emperor's hammer, whose relentless deeds sprawled across 10,000 bloody years, and an uncountable infinity of star systems, a river of sacrifice too vast for any single soul to fathom. Gale's ancient robes, threadbare and the dull, humble gray signifying his renunciation of worldly concerns and service, rustled softly like dry leaves as he shifted his weight again. The only adornment upon him was the simple yet weighty rosette of the Administratum, pinned defiantly to his frayed collar, a tiny badge symbolizing lifetimes of labor and the crushing responsibility for truths that could break lesser minds. A sigh escaped him, a sound as ancient as the shelves surrounding him, heavy with bone-deep weariness yet layered unshakably under with awe, before the artifact dominating his desk. Before him lay a tome immense and imposing, its cover forged of dark, cured hide, reinforced and protected by bands of resilient ceramite, a fortress guarding its contents. Upon it, the titles screamed in solemn high Gothic script inlaid with fading gold, Deeds of the Astra Militarum, a chronicle of valor. Beside it, stacks of thin, fragile vellum awaited his hand and ink, blank receptacles ready to absorb the distilled essence, the painfully extracted marrow, of the Astra Militarum's legendary and agonizing history. Gale dipped the quill once more, the black ink clinging to the nib like ichor. The device moved with the steadiness born of decades of ritual motion, yet Gale's mind raced far ahead, dwarfed by the sheer, mountainous scope of the knowledge he must condense. He must sieve through dust-fine grains of sacrifice, the monumental deeds of Cadia echoing like thunderclaps through the centuries, the last stands of forgotten regiments, whose very names had become mere phantoms drowned out by the unceasing, deafening clamor of history, marching relentlessly on. His work, illuminated solely by the shifting, dust-streaked luminescence of the suspensor globes, and companioned by the faint, ghostly scratching of other unseen scribes lost in distant alcoves, lonely satellites in the void of knowledge, was to impose coherence upon a legacy whose only consistent measure was blood. Beyond the soaring, arched windows, defiant against the internal silence, the ceaseless thrum of Terra's skies intruded, a distant, omnipresent roar of engines vibrating through the very stones, a stark reminder of the galaxy's insatiable demands on the Emperor's toiling, diminished subjects, forever striving against a darkness that seemed a sentient predator, perpetually eager to engulf them whole. Gale paused yet again, the quill a poised dagger suspended above the pale skin of the parchment. He permitted himself a moment, a rare secular devotion of pure contemplation. This labor was sacred, it was a prayer. It was the solemn chance, the crushing duty, to snatch immortality for men and women whose lives were extinguished like sparks in the void, for those who had faced the yawning abyss, stared into its infinite maw, and roared their defiance across an empire barely listening. A steadying breath filled his chest, expanding ribs against the constriction of his robes, hauling in the musty, histor-laden air. The stories, the agonies, the glories sacrificed in mud and radiation-tainted dust would be inscribed. They would, he vowed in his silent ritual, echo throughout the relentless corridors of eternity. In his mind's weary eye, vast plains materialized under bruised skies thick with smoke and the ozone tang of battle, regiment upon regiment mustering, their tattered battle standards unfurling against the wind like the last defiance of forgotten gods. He heard the ghostly thundering roar of millions upon millions of voices, each a spark, each destined for the pyre lifted in a rough-hewn, desperate chorus shouting faith in the Emperor's name. Here, under the unwavering, baleful gaze of the frescoed wars, and among the silent, judgmental whispers of the accumulated history radiating from the shelves, Hieronymus Gale, servant of the beak and the scroll, would defy oblivion. He would ensure, word by agonizing word, that their sacrifice, that river of uncounted lives, would never be consigned to the ultimate emptiness of the forgotten. To begin in this vast ocean, Gil grimly concluded, one must chart the tides. A brief distillation of the Astra Militarum's foundation becomes necessary, both to anchor understanding and prepare the shores for the tumultuous waters of its history that crash in later chapters. The mists of time are as thick and choking as the permanent, greasy smog engulfing Terror's colossal hive city spires, obscuring the precise details of the primordial days. Yet even after 10,000 scorched years, the palest echoes of the thunderous Great Crusade still reverberate, trembling through the bedrock of imperial worlds and resonating deep within the very bones of our soldiers who stand where titans once strode. We, the vigilant instruments of the administratum, the humble and often overlooked scribes of blood and record, stand upon shoulders carved from bedrock the vanished, almost mythic titans who were the Imperiales Auxilia. They were legion, not merely an army, but a living tide of humanity stirred and channeled by the Emperor's impossible will, washing in waves unstoppable across the fractured wilderness of the stars. Millions, billions, numbers fail. Drawn from every conceivable, suffering corner of a known universe exploding outwards, their faces wove a tapestry depicting 1,000 worlds, ruddy from the icebound wastes and glacial howls of Valhalla, weathered bronze from the furnace-blast plains of desert death worlds, grimset to endure the steaming, carnivorous jungles choking Kessa. They answered a call that transcended the comprehension of the individual soul, hearts outwardly filled with the potent promises of a future washed clean, a golden future they knew, in the grim, unspoken depths of their shared resolve, they might never even glimpse for themselves. They marched alongside the Astartes, the god princes encased in the adamantium shells of their dread craft, a sight majestic and terrible even in fragmented pictochords. Yet where the Space Marines served as the Emperor's clenched fist, the annihilating blow delivered with impossible speed and precision, the Auxilia, they were the anvil, the unyielding wall, the colossal, grinding pressure that broke enemy resolve not through brilliance, but through attrition most fundamental. The crushing weight of implacable human will made manifest as bodies and bullets. This expanse humanity sought to claim was no longer a mystery held by myth and legend. It was mapped by blood and sacrifice, vast beyond comprehension and unforgiving in its hostility. It remained, and ever remains, teeming with predation both alien and familiar. The xenos, those ravening alien horrors dripping ichor onto unspoiled earth, lurked perpetually within fathomless shadows. Within humanity's own vitals, however, a more insidious treason fermented, the whispers of heresy, the cunning snakegulls of rebellion threatening to tear the thin skin of the nascent Imperium apart through fratricide writ large. Against these twin implacable horrors, the Auxilia solidified into humanity's first, broad bulwark, an unwavering shield desperately protecting the fledgling Imperium from the ravenous darkness forever pressing close. They served as guardians in the most literal sense, guardians of shattered hopes, guardians of the emaciated spark of mankind, guardians ultimately of the Emperor's fading dream, glimpsed only through a glass darkly as it was brutally forged. But dreams, even those conceived in the searing crucible of relentless war, can curdle into the grimmest nightmares. When the Horus heresy descended across the imperial firmament, it brought with it a darkness so profound it dimmed even the Emperor's bound radiance. It didn't just shatter the foundations, it dynamited them, collapsing reality itself into chaotic micro-skirmishes across a million worlds. Brothers, forged in gen-enhanced fire, turned upon themselves with claws and blasphemous fury in a civil war that scarred the soul of humankind like acid-etching ceramic. The Auxilia, caught with terrifying suddenness in the crossfire of these demigods clashing, were shattered. Their indomitable fleets were bombed into plasteel confetti swirling in the void, their chains of command severed as if by blunt scissors, logic abandoned, order crumbling as chaos reveled in its intoxicating supremacy, maddening supreme. From this planetary maelstrom of absolute destruction, this psychic nuclear winter pulverizing faith itself, the Astra Militarum clawed itself into being. It was the phoenix, yes, but a phoenix forged from wounding shrapnel, rising not upon pure flame but from the sulphurous ashes of betrayal, its feathers charred and its song a guttural scream. The lessons seared onto imperial consciousness by the heresy were the bitterest chalice. The Emperor's vision, so grand, so ambitious, demanded immediate action tempered by icy, ruthless pragmatism. History screamed its warning. Power left unchecked inevitably decayed into corruption, seeping into the very foundations. Trust gifted carelessly became the anvil upon which betrayal forged its treacherous blade. And so the Astra Militarum was born anew, forged specifically in the crucible scorched by Horus's pyre, its very structure a grim memorial to past failure, designed to prevent yet another such cataclysm. The umbilical cord linking the void-spanning Navy commandments and the planet-conquering Army divisions was deliberately severed, a brutal surgical procedure demanded by survival, a sacrificial amputation to halt the metastasis of rebellion. The colossal state-blanketing legions were shattered, recompiled into regiments, each a microcosm of the Imperium itself, structurally isolated, bred unto itself, its loyalty laser-focused purely upon Terra, upon the entombed Emperor held only as a cold, dead visage upon their standards. The commissars were sent forth. Their figures, clad in the black of final judgment, became constant, watchful presences, their eyes flinty windows constantly scanning for the first, faint flicker of heretical muttering, the subtle tremor signaling nascent rebellion waiting to blossom into bloody revolt. They stood as stark reminders, gifted their power to judge unto death, of the eternal price demanded by disloyalty, a necessary thrombus of unflinching hardness injected into a shattered system, a brutal methodology essential to counter the terrifying fragility threatening to render the Imperium dust. The age of the Auxilia closed with the finality of a tomb sealing, a necessary ghost sacrificed. A new, darker era, the grim darkness dawned, an era defined solely by constant vigilance screamed into the void, of endless grinding war prosecuted on a million bleeding fronts. The Astra Militarum, the Emperor's hammer. Thus it stands, perpetually poised at the abyss's rim in readiness against the relentless darkness, perpetually seeking to consume the fragile candle flame of human existence. The Astra Militarum has long clawed its title like a shield boss seared into flesh, Hammer of the Emperor. This epithet is forged not from idle boast, but meticulously annealed in the furnaces of unstoppable centuries of relentless warfare paid for by sacrifice stacked upon sacrifice piled atop sacrifice, stretching back into unrememberable antiquity. To truly understand the brutal poetry of this name is to grasp the fundamental, horrifying calculus underpinning the Imperium itself. A weak yet ferocious empire stretched beyond breaking across a galaxy, perceived as a predator-ravenous galaxy, an empire compelled continuously to lash out, to destroy utterly, simply to hold its tattered borders for another dark cycle. Imperial maps document stars gleaming as mere distant, transient embers suspended in weathered leather scrolls within chambers like this very sanctum, fleeting beacons of life, flickering amidst suffocating pitch. Communication binding these scattered jewels exists only through a horrifying lifeline, the roiling, insane sea of the Empyrean, the warp and abyss where time writhes in agony and reason dissolves like salt in acid. This realm is treacherous beyond madness incarnate, yet its violating embrace remains brutally necessary, the sole conceivable artery pumping coherence, however corrupted, between the Imperium's decaying territories. Even this dimension-spanning lifeline seeps with cancerous flaws as standard, messages inevitably delayed like time-bound stones, sinking in treacle entire fleets, vanishing into gaping non-existence. intricate strategies ruthlessly unmade by the capricious, tidal whims of the Imperium. Against this backdrop of incomprehensible strategic submarine struggle playing in a sea of insanity, the Astra Militarum is conscripted onto the stage grim to perform the dual, impossible role of both sentinel, the watchful eye peering into the void, and executioner, the revolver shot delivered without remorse or warning, perpetually forced to act, invariably in isolation, devoid of coordination or support from the distant, ghostly entities calling themselves command. Warfare waged in this scarred 41st millennium bears little resemblance to the glorious sagas peddled by hololith propagandists. Victory is not seized through glittering acts of daring, singular paragons of heroism, nor moments of tactical brilliance lighting the tactical review chambers. Victory is extracted solely, painfully, drop by drop, through the grinding, flesh-rending gears of relentless attrition, vast logistics chains feeding blight into the maw. The Imperial Guard is this grinding totality, this embodiment. They bring to bear the immense grindstone of humanity's war machine against any xenos mutation, any heretic madness, any existential threat rising to contest the choked light emanating from this throne world. They seek neither parity of arms nor aristocratic subtlety. They drown their mutated, monstrous foes in an all-consuming flood of stubborn human will and overwhelming, earth-shattering firepower hurled without restraint. Yet beneath the commanding silhouette of the mighty Lemon Rust battle tanks shaking continents, beyond the deafening, physics-steering roar of basilisk artillery, turned skywards at suicidal angles to scream defiance, lies the pulsing, bleeding heart sustaining this colossal embattled machine, the infantry. They are countless, immeasurable, facsimiles rendered insignificant by scale, their ranks refilled with unthinkable efficiency from each generation squeezed dry upon worlds harvested for war. Their faces, glimpsed briefly under the harsh glare of arc lamps fizz lighting muddy trenches, are forgotten as swiftly as they vanish amidst cordite smoke and splattering mud. Each regiment commanded represents but a single, anonymous grain of damned sand plummeting through the unforgiving glass belly of the great hourglass, measuring out imperial warfare. Each life within it is meticulously measured, poured unceremoniously onto the scales, and remorselessly poured out without sentiment, except the grim calculation of cost efficiency. And yet this dehumanized anonymity is absolute. A guardsman possesses no identity beyond a stamped number on a worn dog tag rasping against a sweat-stained uniform tunic. They are not a person. They are a unit of ammunition, a single round mass-produced upon conveyor belts stretching into nightmare vistas. Their budding lives, blooming briefly, are tallied dispassionately on the flickering, scrolling tactical screens overseen by commanders light years away, ghostly projections sacrificing ghostly projections. Their deaths, whether slow and agonizing beneath flensing knives or instantaneous in radiant vaporization, are precisely, mechanically reduced to sterile statistics in the eternal calculus of cold-blooded planetary survival. The command barked over vox channels, static-laced and distant, carries no consolation, demands no heroics beyond the necessary. They are implored to preserve nothing, ordered only to expend their precious cargo of flesh and fear wisely, maximizing the return on each investment of blood drawn from suitable worlds nominally loyal. And yet, astonishingly, frighteningly, piercing through this crushing indifference arises stubborn patriotism. Despite the cold mathematics of annihilation, the grinding dehumanization that steamrolls hope itself, there are moments startling as saints, miracles amidst plague pits, when the searing courage of individual guardsmen flares defiantly above the impersonal abattoir carnage unfolds around them. Legends whisper, past soldier to soldier like plague warnings, that the irresistible tide of a planet-spanning battle shifts not solely by the thunderous deployment of 1,000 armored behemoths, nor by orbital bombardment scarring continents, but by the desperate, saving spark ignited by a single company, ripped to remnants fighting towards internal extinction. Imagine that crucible moment, a ragged sliver of guardsmen, their uniforms scorched rags slick with mud, and the viscous fluids of former comrades, thick clots of broken bodies tainting the churned earth around their boots. Their lasguns spit impotent hoarse crimson beams, ammunition packs long drained, their exhausted voices hoarse yet rising nevertheless in a ragged, last defiance roar as they brace their broken formation against an advancing tsunami of alien nightmare biology, drawing grim final breaths. They do not stand rooted by halcyon hope, nor expectation of gilded victory. They stand because duty, forged within stern centuries of conditioning, demands they consume that final breath for their fellows. They stand because to falter, to shrink back until the ground vomits them into individual graves, would mean the instant death, the torture beyond imagining, of the evacuating wounded stumbling away behind them, cherishing fragile life perhaps still 5 minutes longer. The collapse of that line in one sector, triggering the fatal domino cascade, collapsing the entire defense, permitting the consuming darkness unfiltered access to the desperate millions trying to flee, holding the last transports loading kilometers away. These agonizing moments, inevitably small, swallowed by history's vast grand chroniclers whose pages thirst after planetary warlords and stellar admirals resigned to strategic file. These flickers of doomed defiance are, Gil ruminates with resigned wonderment, the true beating heart of the Astra Militarum. Such staggering, soul-defying heroism does not spring from blissful ignorance. Every guardsman, artillery guardsman, bless them with any span of life, beyond the first meat-grinder drops, inevitably learns the crushing dread of the universe unveiled. They have peered into the all-consuming, soulless glare of the Necron hibernations woken within ancient tombs, relics of races dead before Terra's master walked incarnate. They have witnessed the chilling physiological impossibility of green tidal waves crashing upon fortresses, orcs in their crude numbers layered towards infinity, chanting mindless screams of warju, chanting, save the laughter became shrieks when closed. They have inhaled deeply the unnatural fetid corruption radiating from chaos-warped landscapes, a stench creeping into the soul like cancer's tendrils. They do not raise weapon and scream charge towards such madness, because they whisper belief in trivial triumphs capable of vanquishing its formless entity. They fight, crouched trembling behind shattered rockcrete, because gentle surrender equals immediate abandonment of humanity itself, surrender yielding infection seeping irrevocably into their lineage, allowing darkness unholy to coalesce, form, and finally extinguish all. It is tragically commonplace, a doctrine understood implicitly across regiments' whispered nightmares, that entire campaigns demanding annihilation, exchanges of millions upon millions of bodies, processed through cynicism controlling hive factories, are required merely to secure often a single, irradiated rock bled dry of strategic value by time, and the roots of this terrible legacy. Gil notices sharply, his quill instinctively departing the sacred text, stained sacred with stories' mere inscriptions upon flayed histories. Beneath the frozen surface whispered by sheer weight of elders passing lore mouth to our tongues, these roots burrow deep into the unlit primordial soil of humanity's once fractured obscurity. They stretch claw-like graspingly backwards, back towards Terra's own scarred infancy, and dreadful emergence screaming from the age of strife's suffocating womb. An epic witness Terra rendered a desolate battleground upon whose primordial ash and irradiated ruins warlords, maddened pygmies compared to even hive nobles today, ruled over techno-barbarian hordes wading through radioactive sludge-piled mountains. An era where the future Imperium's cradle spat hypocrisy, coughing until the magnificent glories born ages past were mercilessly stick-reduced to toxic ashes piled beneath collapsing pre-Imperial castles tower-bearing. It was within this ultimate crucible foundation, Gil concedes recognized immediately upon accessing early fragmented rock-carved microrecords spooled automatically. Formed within scorched earth history, an echoing betrayal din lingered beyond those sealed windows streaming diluted daylight onto vellum, already drying, committing near-sacred truth, witnessed unparalleled sacrifice, coldly forging imperial future materially, upon whose honored, consecrated corpse the Astra Militarum, now dogma etched. The Emperor of Mankind, a titanic figure among the shattered remnants of Terra's onsuaring tribes, rose from the toxic ruins of the strife epic, his indomitable will bending the broken to his purpose. From the ashes and genetic slurry of that forsaken age, he forged the first army's grim legions of xenos, warriors patched and augmented through mysterious arts, their enhanced forms the nascent spark against the darkness. These relentless soldiers, products of a desperate world tearing itself apart, hammered the fractured techno-barbarian domains back into submission during the brutal unification wars, their bootsteps echoing through the dust-choked canyons of old Earth as they imposed a terrifying order. Victory upon grim victory bled the poisoned soil of Terra Crimson, and from this crucible of conquest, the Emperor dreamt vast. He built the Primarchs, godlike sons of his own essence, and the legions Astartes, demigods encased in thunderous ceramite, who would be the spear tip of the Great Crusade. But even these god machines of war needed steel beneath their feet. The xenos, the hardened regiments of the unification, became the bedrock of the fledgling Imperial army, the enduring anvil against which the Emperor's celestial ambitions were struck. Through those early heady days of reclaiming the stars, dragging humanity's scattered, frightened children back from isolation, they were the ever-present foundation the glowing dream of the Imperium rested upon. They were the first beat of the hammer of the Emperor, its ponderous blows falling relentlessly onto fractured human kingdoms and alien empires alike, the impacts resonating through the void, the drumbeat marching alongside the superhuman legions carving order from the abyss. This hammer, wielded by the Emperor and his demigods, sculpted an Imperium from nebulae and bone-strewn planets, unifying the disparate shards through unyielding force. Whispers cling to the guard like grave dust. It is said the Imperium breathes only so long as the last guardsman draws breath, only until the final lasgun sputters its dying charge against the encroaching horror. Until that grim twilight, the hammer falls again and again. Yet the dream required more than ideology and warriors of legend during those earliest crusade days. It demanded boots on the ground, unbreakable multitudes, to secure the ground won by the unstoppable advance of the legions. The galaxy sprawled vast and infinitely hungry, even for superhuman attention. As conquest stretched the nascent Imperium thin across impossible distances, the noble myth of the Emperor's vision ground against the relentless gears of necessity. To hold the world's newly wrenched from barbarism and xenos control, to ensure the borders didn't fray before the vanguard propelled further into the unknown, the fledgling Imperial army swelled into existence. Conceived not in some palace of polished obsidian on Terra, but in the mud and blood of distant compliance, forged from raw need, not ceremony. It gathered disparate elements: fervent volunteers credulous of the Emperor's promise, grim-faced mercenaries sworn for coin or survivalism, remnants of indigenous forces defeated during compliance, their varied battle harnesses painted with fresh Aquila symbols scraped over older loyalties. At first, their role was garrison, peacekeeper, holding the line against insurgents and marauders amidst the shattered ruins left in the wake of the Legion's swift thrust. Slowly, relentlessly, as the crusade gnawed into the galactic east, devouring stars and spitting out imperial fists, the nature of the army underwent a profound and thunderous shift. The nascent warp-capable ships once used only for troop transit became battle fleets in their own right, a command structure blossoming, and this new Leviathan learnt to walk entirely on its own. No longer confined as sentries, the army marched with its creation. It swallowed planetary tithes whole, entire regiments drawn like tribute blood from hive worlds heaving with teeming billions, where desultory muster lines snaked for kilometers, or sparse frontier planets offering up barely a few hundred sons and daughters clad in local burlap uniforms, handed las rifles still smelling of factorum grease. The logistical coils of the munitorum, calcifying into early form measured tithes with chilling precision, balancing loyalty against utility, each contribution an echo of dominance paid in flesh and bone. Billions strong now, a surging tide of humanity clad in borrowed armor, the army evolved from shield to colossal hammer itself. Vast battle groups detached, conquering systems without a single gleaming Astartes pauldron in sight, deploying monstrous war engines, land battleships called tanks, and fleets that blotted out stars, a rolling tide of gunmetal and grim resolve capable of grinding entire star systems beneath its armored treads, or reducing rebellious continents to steaming glass beneath plasma bombardment, conquering and holding solely in the Emperor's name. Precisely this crushing strength, this terrifying autonomy grown from necessity, became the crack that shattered the galactic dream. When Horus Lupercal, the Warmaster once beloved, the Emperor's brightest son, turned the shining truth of the Imperium into a chaos-scarred lie, the Imperial army's might curdled into its darkest nightmare. Fully half the Astartes legions embraced damnation, and swirling in their monstrous wake came vast swathes of the Imperial army's finest, entire battle groups armored to the teeth, their fleets teeming with corruption. The hammer became the serpent intent on biting the hand that forged it. Worlds screamed as orbital bombardments ceased to be the anvil heralding liberation and became instruments of apocalypse. Streaks of plasma ignited cities into infernos, the skies weeping ash, oppressive clouds choking all life beneath. Armored columns, bearing once-proud Aquilas now defiled with obscene runes of blood and brass, rolled over loyalist positions, grinding friend and foe alike beneath rust-caked treads into crimson paste staining ruined plazas. Brothers recognized brothers in narrow trench lines, choked with mud rendered slick with gore, only to realize their las rifle barrels were now aimed at one another across piles of rubble that were once homes. The proud light of compliance, the unity achieved through unimaginable sacrifice, drowned in rivers of pulverized bone and offal, replaced by the actinic glare of chaos arcing across ruins, and the obscene green fire belched from idolatrous shrines hastily erected to alien, malevolent gods. The betrayal of the legions was a shattering blow, but it was the scale of the Imperial army's defections that truly drove the knife into the Imperium's heart. These were the forces intrinsically designed to hold ground, policing systems far from Terra's gilded core. They were self-sufficient entities, entrusted with guarding mankind's fragile unification. Now entire fleets, brimming with battlecruisers and regiments hardened to obey Imperial orders without question, turned those gleaming tools of conquest and garrison against the foundations of the Emperor's vision itself, striking inward with terrible familiarity. The Horus heresy ended, leaving the Imperium a ragged, bleeding behemoth staggering amidst its own entrails. The Emperor, impossibly broken by his faithless son, slid onto the bleeding wound that was the Golden Throne, sustained by lunatic machines and the psychic screams of souls fed screaming into an eternal void furnace. From this absolute nadir, Robot Guilliman, the Avenging Son, picked up the blood-soaked shards of the broken empire. His reforms were born of paranoia and frozen grief. Trust itself was declared a casualty. The unified Imperial army, so devastatingly effective when corrupted, could not survive. It was torn asunder, a surgery performed with cold certainty. Two entities rose phoenix-like from its sundered corpse: the Imperial Navy, sovereign over the silent void, and the Astra Militarum Imperial Guard, the hammer now shackled to the planetary surface, its regiments forbidden forever from touching the stars they defended. The link was severed like diseased nerve cords. No single ambitious, corruptible commander would ever again wield both fleet orbit and surface force autonomy, the very power Horus had abused to nearly rend reality. The newly forged Astra Militarum existed within a prison of pragmatic, iron constraints. Regiments were reduced to isolated cells, autonomy sacrificed brutally on the altar of absolute security, tied inexorably to administratum sanction and the cold, watching eyes of the Munitorum. Coordination became a tangled web spun by distant functionaries, adaptability often chained by procedure designed solely to prevent unity beyond rigid command structures. Above all loomed the black-robed commissars of the fortified Officio Prefectus, grim arbiters of existence and extinction, their presences a freezing shadow across every command bunker and rallying point. These iron-shod arbiters carried the vitriolic authority to execute hesitation with a precise boltron to the skull over cowardice or perceived dissent, with flamboyant sword strokes that cleaved heads from shoulders, transforming fear into fortitude and faith into a desperate belief against reason, twin pillars shoring up a military machine designed not for conquest, but grim, bloody endurance. This reformation was survival at a terrifying price. The Guard was now a blunt, grinding instrument, clunky and costly compared to the Crusade's swiftness, its every potential advantage sacrificed to ossify against treason. Yet Guilliman's brutal calculus proved itself in the galaxy's unrelenting dark. Rebellions were fragmented, contained like cancer cells crushed before any metastasis could begin. The Astra Militarum became an anchor. Thus inscribed upon the history of the stars and fought over ever since, the Guard drew its uncountable defenders from worlds beyond counting. A million whispers of defiance and resignation blended into a roar, tales of home cherished and lost forged within the heat of lasgun barrels, local saints born in the mud, tales propagandized in soot-filled planetary archives, or murmured over a shared pinch of bland proton paste around guttering auspex lights in stinking trenches, triumphs etched onto melted metal trophies melted, tragedies drowned in cheap amasic passed silently between soldiers whose eyes say everything. The duty remains singular: stand, hold, sacrifice. Cadia, the adamantium bastion overlooking the mad rift of the Eye of Terror, became their fixed pole star, entire generations doomed to stare into the soul-dimming horror beyond the sky, holding the impossible line against chaos itself as the Imperium bled elsewhere. The Adeptus Ministorum wove faith deeper than steel into their marrow, as the uncaring millennia ground relentlessly on. Ministorum priests wearing prayer parchments thick as armor, voices booming with borrowed thunder, united disparate conscripts from icebound wastelands, and acid-corroded hive underbellies under one chilling hymn, brandishing the Aquila like a shield against the tangible horror whispering beyond the parapets. Yet not all sacred duty was chanted over crackling vox. The tech priests of Mars, redrobed surgeons scraping sacred oils onto skull mechanisms burning with binary prayers, bent over the rumbling hearts of lemon rust battle tanks promising succor to the defiant roar of their engines, the chanting priests on the surface denied. Engine seers connected spiritually to the machine's spirit within the heavy bolter, whose sacred oils ensured it did not jam amidst blinding promethium fumes choking a trench line, but darkness inevitably seeped in. The shadow of the 36th millennium, the age of apostasy, fell upon them all when the despot Goj Vander, manipulating both throne and altar, turned the Guard's muscle into his personal instrument of terror. Only the shock wave of Saint Sebastian Thor's defiant sermons echoing in the ears of common soldiery, reinforced by the sudden thunderclap attacks of Astartes' legion sanctuaries and the implacable golden giants of the Custodes, shattered this internal nightmare, adding another bloody chapter to their frozen struggle. The decades rolled into brutal centuries, then millennia punctuated only by the dark stars of Abaddon's carnivorous black crusades, ripping apart the Imperium's sagging frontiers. The ceaseless insectal screeching of tyrannid hive fleets, consuming planetary population, centers whole, monstrous orc invasions trampling entire star sectors under a tide of green muscle at places like Armageddon. In desperate holding actions, purging traitor cells during the Gothic War, grinding down regiment after regiment sacrificed to oblivion amid punishing void battles and nerve gas horrors. Victory flickered only briefly. Lord Commander Solar Macharius carved a cataract of burning compliance through 1,000 worlds, leaving a path of heroes hewn into legend, while simultaneously soaking the segmentum in guardsmen's blood. And in the heresy's searing aftermath stood the Great Scouring, the icy counterstroke rising like vengeful ghosts from Terra's half-collapsed hulk. The Guard became the cleansing fire, sweeping the crippled, shattered remnants of humanity's unified territory clean. Traitors fled terror-stricken into the cancerous wound of the eye-carrying, corrupted war engines and soul-breaking incantations. The Imperium chased them into the impossible psychic storms, seeking not conquest but utter erasure. Vengeance served colder than the void. Entire battle groups launched into the dreadful silence of exile duty, hounded the fractured traitor legions through warp-twisted stellar wastes. Orbital bombardments scourged surfaces bare down to luminosity in the cold starlight, making planets sterile tombs. Vast siege lines bristling with guard tank regiments and artillery, the size of hablocks, surrounded fortress towns entrenched for decades. The loyalist Astartes exorcised planets still radiating cosmic dread wrought by Horus's armada even on Terra itself, their homeworld haunted by ghosts of betrayal, a bitterness flowing as thick as blood through long-forgotten tunnels beneath molten battlefields, seeing the taint everywhere, demanding scouring fires burn away not just the bodies of betrayers, but the very shadows they cast on monuments. Planets vanished from maps deliberately forgotten. The Guard was the implacable fist-crushing retroactive heresy out of existence symbol by symbol, curse by curse, conscript by sacrificial conscript until a fragile security was purchased, the worn hammer steadied, ready to fall again against the next surge of darkness, its head forged in ancient Terra, its handle stained permanently with the blood of Horus's gamble. Wounds that would not cauterize bled into history, bled into the very soul of the wounded Imperium. These were not mere injuries of flesh but deep, festering psychic scars that ignited the relentless pursuit known as the Scouring. The iron hands moved, cold and implacable instruments forged anew in the fires of betrayal at the Dropsite massacre. Their vengeance was a precision strike, unfeeling and mathematically executed, seeking not just bloodets paid, but the absolute annihilation of traitor genetic material wherever the tendrils of the Warmaster's taint had reached. Across burning sectors, the space wolves answered with a howl that echoed through the void, feral suns unleashed, tearing through corrupted strongholds with a savagery that blurred the line between warrior and wild beast. While stars burned under lupin wrath, Robot Guilliman, bearing the unbearable weight of a fractured galaxy upon his shoulders, steered the Ultramarines through the wreckage, rebuilding, reordering, ensuring no haven remained for the fleeing heretics, his indomitable will applied to the crushing machinery of survival. Beside these giants strode the newly forged Astra Militarum, a million faces stiff with resolve beneath helmets, born from the fractured bones of the old Imperial army. They were the wall against which the roiling countertides of chaos broke, the anonymous thousands digging trenches under enemy fire, fortifying shattered cities, manning labyrinthine defenses night after terror-filled night. They carried lasguns and bayonets against monstrous forms from beyond sanity, bearing something heavier still, the desperate, grinding resolve of a species dangling over the abyss of annihilation. On worlds stained by betrayal, planets where the Emperor's light had been extinguished by treachery, the Guard's grim standards were driven into the polluted earth. They reclaimed those lost territories inch by soul-crushing, bloody inch, their sacrifice measured in mountains of their own dead. Yet the Scouring seemed more than merely purge. The galaxy itself writhed in a kind of anguished rebellion. Worlds that had clung to neutrality during the heresy's storm found no mercy when the loyalist hammer descended. To the sons and daughters of the wounded Imperium, hesitation was a cancer, neutrality a betrayal deserving only one response, cleansing fire and merciless steel. Upon these isolated battlefields, the Astra Militarum and the freshly configured Adeptus Arbites became instruments of pitiless imperial justice, their actions grim necessities undertaken in shadows cast by galactic oppression, acts forever darkened by their ruthless demands. Guilliman, the regent bound by impossible duty, orchestrated the restructuring of humanity's broken might. He shattered the monolithic imperial army into countless smaller, specialized divisions, a necessary fragmentation mirrored painfully among the legions. His great treatise, the Codex Astartes, demanded the fracturing of the vast Astartes legions into compact chapters, each a mere 1,000 warriors strong. It was a surgical amputation, a painful sundering of brotherhoods forged in fire and blood, a sacrifice enacted so that no single demigod could ever again wield the cataclysmic power of an entire legion's war machine. Even the sons of Macreg bowed before the decree, the Ultramarines spawning innumerable successor chapters, smaller torches lit from their ancestral flame, destined to carry Guilliman's cold blue legacy into the grim darkness of future stars. Finally, the active violence of the scouring waned, though its bitter embers smoldered with endless hate. The traitors were flung, broken but eternally poisonous, into the seething hellscape of the Eye of Terror. The Imperium emerged, victorious on parchment, yes, but mortally diminished. The blazing, idealistic light of the Great Crusade was extinguished utterly, replaced by a struggling, guttering ember fueled solely by the grim imperative of survival. The Emperor's dream, a galaxy unified, free from the shackles of superstition and mindless fear, had perished on the anvil of the Horus heresy. In its place ascended an Imperium clad in shadow, governed by ossified bureaucracy, enforced by crushing dogma, driven only by the relentless, unyielding will to endure the endless night. Now, history narrows its harsh eye to one particular battleground, a war against the ruinous powers not with a thunderclap, but with a treacherous whisper's insidious beginning. This conflict, the Siege of Vrax, defies simplicity, neither swift nor easily chronicled. Its overture is an ancient tragedy, etched into the Imperium's decaying spine, the ambition corruption of a man of God, the loyal servant twisted into a marionette dancing on chaos strings, the sheer, suffocating vastness blurring the creeping infection until it ruptured. It began, as countless grim tales do, with a death. Cardinal Astor Borca, his presence a fixture ruling the Scara sector across impossible centuries courtesy of Mars Biologa's alchemy, had stood as a mighty bastion of imperial faith. Yet even Mechanicus Technomagic dances reluctantly with entropy. In 84M41, the ancient cardinal exhaled his final prayer-scented breath into the unforgiving void. Stepping into that vacuum, clad in seemingly righteous purpose, strode Cardinal Zaffin, the chosen successor, a figure of silvered oratory and burning conviction, radiating the zeal the Imperium demanded of its shepherds. Or so the illusion held. Zaffin's ascension was a spectacle befitting the God Emperor's own representative. Grand processions choked hive streets, sermons roared from towering pulpits, great cathedral bells tolled their leaden dirge, and hymns soared from 10,000 pious throats. Yet scarcely had the cathedral incense cleared when the new cardinal announced a pilgrimage. This grand progress, a journey piercing the heart of the Scara sector, promised spiritual renewal for the masses and cemented his nascent dominion. Accompanied by a swelling cortege of preachers exhorting, elite sisters of battle clad in ceramite faith, a glut of sycophantic retainers, Zaffin sought to ignite a wildfire of devotion. Where he strode, faith did blaze fiercely. Tyrants faced sudden downfall, rebellions blossomed screaming the Emperor's name, and hope roared like a star going nova. To the adoring masses, Zaffin was transfigured. No longer merely a man, he became a living conduit, an anointed saint bearing the sacred flame of divine will itself. But deep beneath the blinding fervor, within the cardinal's innermost sanctum, the rot bloomed. Among his most trusted counselors skulked Deacon Mammon, a serpent wrapped in honeyed platitudes, his soul long ago bartered to the grinning monstrosities of the warp. Unseen by his master, Mammon perpetually whispered. He murmured insidious secrets of destiny into Zaffin's willing ear, fanning the latent embers of pride and monstrous ambition into a consuming blaze. He painted the cardinal not just as a guide, but as the Messiah reborn, heaven's own warrior destined to wield holy fire against the cancer, consuming the Imperium from within. Treacherous poison dripped from every syllable, twisting Zaffin's once-staunch faith into a seething weapon aimed at the very civilization he was ordained to serve. The man of devout duty curdled. He saw schemes lurking in every loyal gaze, daggers hidden within humble reports. Trust vanished, preserved only for those whose loyalty could be purchased with promises or crushed beneath threats. Guided by Mammon's clawing whispers, Zaffin wove a stagnant pool of devotion around himself, an inner circle bound by fiercely sworn oaths, men and women drowning alongside him in the conviction of the Imperium's terminal decay. Only a great firestorm of holy war, they believed, could cauterize the festering wound. They chose their inferno stage carefully, Vrax. An Imperial armory world of staggering strategic value, a fortress planet armored in forgespires and bastions, a pulse point in the galactic war machine. Crucial still, Vrax bore the shrine of St. Leonis the Blind, sacred ground consecrated by martyrs' blood, drawing endless tides of pilgrims. Beneath this veneer of piety and industry, beneath the planet's very skin, the machinery of schism began its horrific churn. Mammon's agents, disguised as priests, insinuated themselves among thronging pilgrims and hardened labor gangs. Whispers spread like pestilent mold through sweating tunnels and echoing shrine halls, whispers of an imminent threat of the faithful to the holy site. These calculated embers of paranoia ignited swirling eddies of zealotry. Common men envisioned themselves consecrated soldiers bracing for the apocalypse's dawn. Simultaneously, Mammon slithered into the shadows where military commanders dwelled, applying promises of divine favor and sly leverage to ensure Xrax's formidable shield walls would answer only to Zaphan's divinity. By the time faint echoes of brewing sedition reached distant Imperial monitors, Vrax was already a shuttered coffin. Its immense planetary batteries loomed, ancient cannons of god-killing power now sighted menacingly into the void. Within the vast, echoing gloom of his citadel, Zaphan assembled the core of fanatics and unveiled the terrifying scope of his ambition. Gone was the humble servant. Here stood the self-proclaimed prophet of the new dawn, the chosen scourge who would purge weakness from the palace of stars. The faithful still flocked, their devotion impervious to his increasingly unholy rants. They shared his conviction. They were holy, this war was righteous. Their very existence signified the blessed emperor's will. The throne sat silent, its light eternally distant and unreadable. It cast no illumination upon this tortured world. The darkness behind Zaphan's fervor, nurtured by chaos whispers, became a lodestone drawing truly ruinous entities. Beneath the glittering, hollow veneer of his holy crusade lay the horrific truth. Zaphan, ensnared, corrupted, his faith defiled, his vision twisted into a sacrificial knife sculpted for the ruinous powers. The stage groaned under the weight of inevitable carnage. When the Officio Assassinorum struck, deploying a Vindicare paragon of death unshot, one kill to snuff the heretical spark before wildfire, it was fire that recoiled upon itself. Cloaked in shadow for agonizing cycles, a flawless instrument of extinction awaited its moment. As Zaphan raised his arms before innumerable throats chanting his name, the bolt was released. It was linegesturing, a perfectly whispered death kiss traveling through the thick air. Yet the Emperor's hand did not guide its trajectory that day. Metallic miracle, Zaphan's Rosarius, a sacred artifact relic refractor field older than faith, flared with impossible light, deflecting the hypersonic round. To the faithful below, it was undeniable divinity manifest, a sign blazing their cardinal saint preserved by imperial will. What should have ended rebellion became its ultimate vindication, a divine catalyst ignited. The volatile labor gangs, seething with manufactured zealotry, exploded into open revolt. Chaos descended like a biblical plague, engulfing racks in a volcanic eruption of frenzy. Machine lines froze as workers seized lasguns. Orbital defenses built to shield against ancient void horrors were wrested inward by their own corrupted officers. The repercussions screamed across the Imperium's crippled logistical spine. Rax Prime served as a vital artery pumping munitions, armor, and the sustenance of war directly to the desperate regiments, holding the Cadian Gadeth last great barrier before the howling tidal wave of chaos poured forth eternally from the Eye of Terror. With Vrax's manufactories choked with heresy, the lifeblood of those defenders was severed cold. Entire subsectors, vital bulwarks, were left frighteningly vulnerable. The heavy, groaning wheels of the Administratum finally ground out its decree. Vrax must be reclaimed. The cost-infinite millennia of lives was irrelevant alongside the catastrophic strategic void. Yet by the time the decree echoed through war rooms, the heretics had already transformed Vrax Prime into an armored, fanged monstrosity. Planetary defense batteries, vast destructive engines honed through ages, now guarded Salvation City like granite sentinels against orbital wrath. Zan's rebels, swollen with looted Imperium warglories and meticulously steeped in the very siegecraft and trench warfare doctrines their former masters perfected, dug deeper than ever. They were coiled, ready blood harvesters laying cruel traps within the dedicated killing grounds they now commanded. Facing this monumental task, the High Command turned to those bred for blood and mud, the death corpse of Krieg. Individuals absorbed wholly into their role, faces hidden forever behind grim rebreather masks distilled from generations grinding warfare into ash, their very existence defined by attrition and unflinching sacrifice. The Armada assembled with glacial, inevitable momentum. The Imperium's vast 88th Siege Army, a tidal wave of gunmetal gray regiments forged solely from Krieg stock, bore the duty. From the outset, the campaign crystallized into brutal statistics. Every lost meter demanded rivers of gore. Every stubborn stronghold center was pulped sevens counting the corpses. The grinding drums of imperial retribution began their dreadful cadence as the 10,000 silenced vile generators hissed their death gases over Nomansland. For 1,700 days turned hellish years, the abattoir consumed millions, leaving a planet scoured to poisoned bedrock. Meanwhile, upon the tortured surface of Vrax Prime, the initial firestorm of rebellion solidified into an iron-fisted hieratic order. The apostate Cardinal's legions, blood-forged from fractious labor gun hordes and the remnants of militarized PDF cogs hardened by betrayal, functioned as a grim engine. Fierce devotion discovered earned power. Commanders emerged, the elite disciples of Zaffin swelled their ranks with the favored fanatics. Lesser sparks of faith found grim purpose in brutal conscription or were driven back beneath the whip, doomed to bone-grinding servitude within the Citadel's rumbling manufactoria engines. Disobedience earned only swift oblivion, administered by Zaffin's cold-eyed enforcers bearing martyrs' zealotry like condemning hammers. Under the Cardinal Tyrant's shadow, Vrax was reshaped into an unyielding bastion of pain. Vast killing fields seeded with hidden death replaced its desolate plains. Forests of cruel razor wire coiled in ever-expanding walls. Heavy gun skeletons tracked every distant dust cloud signaling an enemy's death march. Every defender understood the hideous truth shimmering beyond their ramparts. There would be no surrender, no bargaining chip thick enough to save them. Clemency was dead. Survival slaved solely to the impossible engine of victory. Failure could only bring oblivion-grade exterminatus hammering from the merciless fists of the scornful Imperium, striding towards them through fire and void. The drums grew louder. The air above Vax Primaris thickened, heavy with the sickly tang of ozone and the acrid scent of mast, unwashed humanity and corroded machinery, a prelude to the slaughter-bloated storm gathering around its desolate orbit. Below, the planet itself seemed to hold its breath beneath bruised, ash-choked skies, anticipating the brutal embrace to come. The fortifications, a gnarled network etched into the volcanic wastes by desperate hands and fanatical will, teamed with the apostate Cardinal Astraphan's nightmare army, a perverse reflection of the Imperium it had betrayed. This was not an army forged in discipline, but a desperate amalgam, stitched together from the carcass of loyal service and the festering sores of heresy. At the bleeding edge of this grim host stood the disciples of Zaffin, the Cardinal's chosen elite, distilled cruelty-clad in scavenged flak and stolen ceramite. Their eyes, fever-bright with a faith corrupted beyond redemption, saw not the Emperor's light but the sickly luminescence promised by their twisted prophet. Loyalty wasn't merely pledged, it was branded onto their souls, rewarded with the plundered dregs of worlds they'd helped desecrate. War was their sacrament, the battlefield their sacrificial altar, and mercy an artifact of a feeble past. Descent into the howling dark awaited them, and they welcomed it as a release valve for the fury burning in their veins. Tiered beneath them, rank upon rank of corrupted might solidified the heretical core. The Virian garrison auxiliaries, once the stoic guardians of this vital armory world, stood now as monuments to enforced treason. Their loyalty had buckled under panic or been broken on the rack of Cardinal Zaffin's ambition. Dragged from abandoned guard regiments and planetary defense stockades, they were the disenchanted veterans, the officers without commands, now unified beneath a banner they knew screamed damnation. Yet their pragmatic sin was cold efficiency. Access to Vax's once imperial arsenals, ranks of lemon rust tanks hulking like dormant beasts, basilisks whose long barrels whispered promises of shattering firepower, chimeras ready to vomit infantry into the killzones transformed their betrayal into a terrifyingly effective shield. They lacked the Spatanpolis professionalism of the Astra Militarum. Drills were replaced by grim determination and the cold knowledge that their former comrades would show no quarter. Their strength lay in static defense, in reinforcing shatterpoints, grim technicians of fortified murder rather than maneuverers of fluid destruction. They hunkered down within their pillboxes and trench lines, the stolen arms pointing accusingly outwards. But the true, crushing weight of Astraphan's rebellion poured forth from the churning bowels of the Munitorum itself. The Labor Legion's multitudes of souls ground into dull, hopeless automatons, by decades of crushing servitude beneath the shadow of the Citadel's walls presented Zaffin's greatest tactical paradox, overwhelming numbers born of absolute despair. They were the dregs, the forgotten, minds numbed by the endless mechanical thrum, bodies broken by grueling shifts in weapon factories and logistical nightmares. The Cardinal and his blasphemous cunning offered them a spark in the suffocating darkness, purpose, however catastrophic, or at least a martyr's oblivion. Drawn by desperate hope or coerced at gunpoint by his raptorial enforcers, 1 in 4 discarded their servitor-like existence. Their ranks swelled into a staggering, rage-mutated mass, a seething tide of humanity clad in ill-fitting flak and wielding hastily distributed auto-rifles still slick with factory grease. Though their individual skill was negligible, their morale brittle, the colossal cache of Vax's own manufactoria quickly made them impossible to ignore. Armed, deployed en masse, stirred by Copperal's fury and the terrifying proximity of his disciples, they became a bulwark of desperate flesh and salvaged iron. They held not with precision, but through sheer, grinding weight of numbers, clogging trenches and bolstering crumbling lines, a human wall destined for bloody pulverization. Their pitiful ranks were supplemented by the even more tragically misled, the pilgrims and the petty bureaucrats. Drawn to the shrine of St. Leonis, the blind like moths to a corrupted flame, they sought solace, blessings, a shred of celestial grace. Unaware of the cancerous plot metastasizing beneath the holy facade, their simple, questing faith became putty in the hands of Zaphan's demagogic preachers. Whipped into a frenzy of righteous terror, they were told phantoms besieged their saint. Honest pilgrims clutching devotional trinkets one day, they were handed crude, barely functional guns the next. Bureaucrats whose only battle was red tape found themselves armed and ordered towards the roaring guns, utterly bewildered but committed by the doom-mongering echoing from the Citadel's distorted vox horns. They received the poorest kit, the most cursory training, shoveled into the meat-grinder's maw as expendable chaff to absorb Imperial bullets, their tragic misunderstanding dying with them on the wire. Binding this fractious, desperate host together required tools only the corrupted could wield. Fear became the ultimate commissar. Drawn from the more vicious elements of the garrison or the disciples' ranks, the enforcers strode through the grim trenches like apostles of the gallows, echoes of Imperial commissars, yet stripped of any higher creed beyond terror. Their bolt pistols barked sharp, abrupt punctuation to any hint of doubt, hesitation, or rebellion. Cowardice wasn't chastened, it was vaporized at point-blank range, a visceral, crimson spray chilling even the most fervent disciple. The message was received, cold and clear. Step back onto the loyalists' bayonets or step out of line into the enforcer's muzzle. Retreat offered no sanctuary, only a quicker, more shameful demise. This brutal calculus forged a pale reflection of unit cohesion, unity born of sheer terror under a radioactive sky. Lurking beneath even that base fear, deeper within the Citadel's weeping stone foundations, writhed the truly damned, Zaphan's captive psychers. Torn from the scheduled purges of the black ships, these untrained, unstable minds were shackled in lightless oubliettes, their psychic screams stifled only by heavier chains and mindbreaker wards. Their power was liquid chaos, scalding wild magic that stained the air with an insidious psychic miasma. To the apostate cardinal, these were vessels, fragile cups overflowing with dreadful power, conduits for communion with entities whose intentions damned entire star systems. They were weapons pure and horrific, their gifts twisted into ruinous waves intended to crash over the Imperial lines. Their sanity splintering even in captivity, their release onto the battlefield promised only uncontrolled detonations of agony and warp-spawned horror, their miseries amplifying the battlefield's abattoir cacophony, corrupting the very stone they defended. Thus the Virian traitor militia stood, a cancerous legion birthed from betrayal's womb. Discipline was a frayed rope compared to the Astra Militarum steel cable. Unity was a cobbled raft on a sea of conflicting desperation. But what they lacked in refinement, they compensated for in sheer, fanatical mass and the relentless fortification of their hellish redoubt driven home by constant enforcer drills. They drilled amidst landscape transformed, every manufactorum access tunnel a potential death trap, every ridgeline sown with hidden mines, every open stretch zeroed by captured artillery pieces. Zaphan's hollow promises of salvation echoed against the clang of practice drills with stolen lasguns and the barks of instructors turned enforcer. Surrender was an impossibility, whispered only by fools or corpses. Retreat was oblivion paved by the Cardinal's jackbooted enforcers. The crushing certainty of extermination upon the Imperium's retribution forged them into an immovable object, a grotesque monument fashioned from the Imperium's own discarded parts, rigid in its defiance, a living bastion woven from heresy's desperate thread. Against this shoal of fanatics and conscripts, against these walls of rockcrete and misery, marched the inevitable tide of Imperial wrath. The death corpse of Krieg descended upon Vax Primaris not as heroes chanting divine litanies, but as mute, inevitable fact. Clad in monochrome fatigues thick with the ingrained grime and faint radiation signature of their blasted cradle world, they ascended from their claustrophobic holds in utter, profound silence. The boarding ramps slammed shut behind them like vault doors sealing crypts. Above them, swarming the void like carrion insects drawn by the scent of planetary-scale demise, the fleet stretched across the system, a constellation of troop carriers swollen with Grake-led infantry and munitions, so vast their tonnage would poison worlds, escorts darting like hungry piranhas, grimed naval officers on the bridge of Bellin plotting bombardment runs. This exodus from death to death was orchestrated from afar by Lord Commander Zelker on secure Thracian reel, seeing only ledgers and requisition counts. To him, Vax was a grim but solvable equation. How many ton of shells? How many waves of infantry? How much time? It was arithmetic of annihilation. Touching down was a return to a desolation distantly familiar, yet Kremit's endless deep freeze was replaced by Va X's furnace scowl. The 143rd Siege Regiment, vanguard of the 88th Spearhead Army, meant explicitly to crack this traitor nut, met a landscape forged in malice. Volcanic ash choked every breath in fetid, electrostatically charged cement junkies when the rare rains fell. Violent electrical storms ripped across the heavens, painting the barren Van Merland wastes in sickly flashes of false light that illuminated jagged, rock-strewn plains and treacherous, echoing canyons, implements expertly exploited by the defenders for years under Zaffin's obsessive directive. The citadel itself loomed at the heart of this hostile storm, its spire piercing the pall like a shard of the apocalypse, housing both Zaffin's blasphemous court and the corrupted shrine of Saint Leonis. 3 colossal defensive rings radiated outwards in brutalist profusion scarifications upon the planet's crust, filled with tools for systemic annihilation. Eastern and southern approaches funneled attackers into narrowing gauntlets of rock and overlapping fire. This was the battlefield the Death Corps had been bred to endure since infancy. Crucible sites forever shrouded under nuclear winter skies, sucking trench lines operated into amphitamondrils amid ceaseless bombast, their sole lesson consumption. Their lifespan calculated at induction, chance replaced entirely with grave duty written on standard-issue tombstones, and so anonymity became their shield and shroud. Individuality was cancer, names dissolved into numerical strings. Faces vanished beneath anonymous breather masks filtering the toxic soup, blank visages reflecting squad designations not brothers, fellow gears momentarily interacting, timing death pistons, firing in sequence determined years prior, planning tables, sparse utilitarian offices creming. Each trooper was a near-identical cipher, blank slate receptacle awaiting, orders sigil mechanical pistons, firing mechanism retract, fire, retract, whose sole function remained marching deliverance via overwhelming firepower, coordinated sacrifice, overwhelming weight, death toll, meat grinder. Did they flinch beneath rebreather valleys? Conceivable. Did they ever entertain fate beyond sanctioned oblivion? Such thoughts were like splinter grenades lodged deep inside cortex implants, suppressed implant control, suppression drill, constant conditioning. Life was contingent upon Emperor's use. Death, unnoticed Emperor's currency ledger entries. To reclaim Vax would not be a triumph spun into balladic odes. Zelker twitching, lighting, Brillabreakscape, brittle bones, shapping yells. Logistics carved reality, potential combat, potential sustained assault. Rate ammunition expenditure, liability remissions, logged remorseless precision administration, ordained canon arithmetic projection, validity tables predicted endless. A grim calculus stretched interminably, its accuracy marked cost mountains, chamber shell, vidi fountains. For the Death Corps, acknowledgement existed. Place defined by their own shallow pits, dug firing step, parapet gun position, waiting silence launchboards, shudder endless chorus artillery, barrage open sodden vulnerable chasms defenses. Meatgrinder fed voraciously grim gray feedstock, onto which he saw simply shells fired, costs, incurred balance ledgers, solvency, paid bodies, kilograms of ammunition, fired kill ratios formulated. Peering onto his strategic display, fortress schematic secure bunker Thracian Primaris, it was merely figures invoked realism, allocated casualties, tolerated acceptable parameters. Glory was illusory shimmer dissipating amidst high explosives, riotous blast shockwaves. Only corpses counted, 2 sides transactional slaughter dens, consecrated corruptedly enemies, skill organization, Sebrillian tables, clear overmatch, anonymized delivery duration estimates, standard bereavement compression, assault models, applied decisively, paint, furious inevitability, colorless abattoir. Preparation was prayer, labor a sequence, rituals unto execution. Workers obscene find sufficient truthful passageways, lift David's landcraft conversion, unloading proper ordnance specialist detail wizardry volcano stratum setting placements, commenced utter absence revelry fraternization necessary instructional visual audit, directive tireless preparation stations, begun meticulously chart entrenched obsession corns settler pioneers, specialized deep subsoil assault battery emplacement, certain construction materials, poured cement fortification imperial. Composition stability formally observed without error aspect silent survey, designated sweep landing field perimeter established minefields, calibrated infantry weapon demo pits duty schedule rotations, priority logistical stacking levels, surveyed assistance stacking, preparing mortar platoon preliminary registration fire on index coordinates, outlining trenches map discrepancy commands, attend revised topography phase data inputs confirmation, proceed note briefly realistic. Expectation timeframe plausibility, interrupted holdover reinforce auxiliary screening detachment path, marching assault lanes crawl preparatory condition imminent commencement, established narrative progression steadily towards outer perimeter strongpoints, incomplete relative vulnerability chosen cutting wedge iterative probe decisive concentration crush breach corridor, direct linking citadel organ singularity destruction, calculated sacrifice, corresponding acceptable pave safe tactical. Corridor required sacrifice, beyond planned schedulable attrition, accepted parameters threshold, assured timetable progression deity, logistics computation necessity. Faces obscene rebreathers faces eyes invisible humanity, occluded by necessity, endure toxic faceless operative patterns, relentless competency training drills, silent immovable units manhandling siege pieces impossible tons bulk, inherent curse gorgons ancient baneblades tension vibration earth tremble larger pieces creaking embark landcraft supplies, seeming advance endless regiments machines, moving deformed giant insects heresy, forge world smoldering desert broken contrast monochromic. Legion servitors heretical tide warp, imbued ichor permeate soil, manifesting unnatural horror remain chamber air, tasted charged anticipation, impending first gun crew load firing quadrant elevation, infinitely rehearsed suspense platinum suspended volcanic dusk, commencing unstoppable mechanism sacrificed fuel wheels process barrel cooling systems purge charge rack cleared breach block slam home lock ram home primer detonation, lanyard pull imminent roar annihilating silence rupture. The siege had truly begun cycle sacrosanct orchestrate, ordained, commenced deafening grim aria apocalypse screamed lithobreaker prow World Cup consecrated butcher, unabating sacrifice galactic scale execution imperial will manifest final. Omnia mors, servo est, where would it end? The reality was simple, death ceased matter ended, Gothic numerals ticking down untranscribable scavira macabre finality illumination, observation calculable probability completion, datum chronological contours signaling termination requisition cycle, ordered damning process vindication ledgers, stamped processed historical regard, archive indexed thereafter forgotten empty shell judgment passed. First shots screamed insignia distant impacts raking dust voice trenches, immediate buried, alive spiritual cascade catastrophic momentum, erupt impossible escalate hellborn, began long blood-churning grind inexorable expenditure incurrence, vax voting returns incessant metal rain confirmation, means only currency compensated patiently waiting resolution script, unwinding inevitable outcome stroke future, scripted past grim certainty settled, like tangible shell shock ringing residue eterna. Volley refinery cracking legitimate payment, executed account lore emperor shrine consecrated then tomb deep, none spoke. Dye's rifle pattern load advance fire drill observance motion, weight ordnance comprehension, signal advance officers tensing tannas emitting rarity monosyllabic directive, paused everything awaited inevitable killzone entered volumetric field, prepared overlapping enfilade creating killing ground crawl, began measured meters defiance witnessed muzzle flashes, basalt outcrop emplacement, opening salvo tagged ammunition expenditure, projected consumed variance acceptable commander noted proceeding. Initial impact assessment casualties, incurred estimated within predicted parameters, report submitted endorse continuation, assault tempo established screen advance cease orbital strike zone, predesignated coordinate immediate destruction laser guide signals, incoming naval barrage strikes fluctuating navigational corrections, factored atmospheric interference damping resultant kinetic transfer rate caveat tactical disbursement strategy, authorized awaiting tiered bombardment sequence phase. Transmission acknowledgement receipt commence leveling operation interdict reinforcement pattern, delayed ammunition lift, successfully materialized battery ordered stated interval between barrages, could not be increased given troop concentration exposed position, required suppression requested priority confirmed nourish operation, reserves committed attrition rates demonstrating acceptable values, proceed delegated authority established chains, enacted commit second, reserves cyclical vast scheme. Continued unfolding men died quietly noise, obliterating silent scream channel trade transaction, consolidated value emperor pleased consecration, advanced meter cost souls, persist purchasing reliquary sanctification measured tons expended blood absolution, secured final expenditure inexorable grist, mainly insignificant notation, incremental formations obliterated paperwork processed planetary ledger inquisition, ticked box war continued fronts elsewhere same template. Imputed consumption necessary fulfillment, shrouded cosmic accounting, normality, irrevocable charge human soul, listed assets depreciate singular value aggregate revenues, sacrifice pertinent remainstance, numbered ensuing enclosed permanent briefing, fold structured virtual monument, served purpose perceived aggregate momentary blip, recording sustained campaign activity, archive deemed sufficient expedite recall, scheduled repurpose non-vital segments, later combustion right purification. Sanction recommend mining license, reestablish manufactorum output, assign surcharge heretic reparations, integrate imperial tithe schedule, establish purgatorial confessional shrine, on-site tour incrementally returning incrementally functionality, 20 standard Marys exploitative quotas restored stability, if listen quietly beneath artillery, thunder whimper psychic distort weeping, saint eternally blind, yen the very bones of V's prime groaned under a weight unimaginable. Continental osteoarthritis settling in as, piece by grinding piece across nearly a year, the monstrous bulk of the 88th Siege Army assembled. Its ranks, already colossal, ingested hundreds of thousands of Creek soldiers like coal into a furnace, devoured countless support personnel to oil its colossal gears, and saw the wretched, penal dredgings of Arista the Labor Corps poured out onto the gray wastes in vast, silent droves. Their task was the grim midwifery of war, laying the necessary arteries of destruction. Railways clawed their way, metal scars crisscrossing the desolate plains, groaning beneath the endless flow of artillery pieces coiled like sleeping dragons and mountains of supplies. Camps metastasized against the ashen skyline, constellations of khaki tents and reinforced bunkers rising like necrotic boils, their prefabricated barrack blocks swelling with a tide of men percolating with pent aggression, waiting only for the Iron Corps summons to battle. By the time the final regiment anchored its boots on the brittle, radioactive dirt, the psychic and tectonic pressure was a physical ache, the land itself screaming silently under the suffocating dread of the carnage to come. The plan, etched into a million minds by repetitive doctrine, felt sound, almost banal in its textbook execution. Hemmed within the oppressive shadow of the citadel itself, the heretic defenders of RX had woven their fortress sanctum, concentric nooses of deep-dug trenches, earthen metal bunkers sunk low in the whispering ash, artillery emplacements hulking like petrified beasts. Brutal geology conspired against the attacker, jagged gorges and winding canyons to the south and east choked off massive assault, funneling the 88th's inevitable fury solely upon the western and northern approaches. Here, grinding the faces of men like millstones, victory had to be bought in iron and flesh. The opening act demanded collapsing the sprawling outer cored in a vast spiderweb of earthworks and hidden firing pits teeming with the vile militia of the fallen. The Death Corps regiments, marrow-deep in their resolve, were cleaved for the pincer movement, the merciless bite of the 1st and 30th Line Corps gnawing upwards from the north, the unyielding pressure of the 12th and 34th chewing upwards from the south. Their grim choreography aimed to encircle, to cordon off the diseased heart of the citadel, amputating it utterly from the wider plague of Rax's territories. Relentless pressure, the staff decreed, hammer blows landing simultaneously across the entire bleeding front, forcing the defenders to thin their gray lines into mere smears against the relentless Imperial tide. Breach the outer ring, and the sea regiments, scarred but undiminished, would surge forward, contracting like a massive, inexorable fist, concentrating the immense power forged in fire for the final, ruinous strike. Speed was ingrained doctrine. The outer heretical positions must be gutted, devoured wholesale in a single, thunderous convulsion, regardless of the butcher's bill paid up front. Hesitation allowed the ruinous powers time to weave coordinated blasphemies. Once the mangled corpse of the outer defenses lay secured, the drive towards the second, inner line could proceed with a predator's wary calculation, cautious probes replacing the hammer blow, seeking out weaknesses like gangrenous rot concealed beneath scorched earth before committing the full weight again. The fall of that second line would be the ringing of the citadel's death knell, true separation complete. Then from the sanctified mud 1,000 miles hence, an incalculable distance dominated yet by the leprous ziggurat on the horizon the Death Corps artillery parks, vast blocks of grim mechanics and metallurgy, could unleash the true siege. Earthshaker cannons, capable of cracking continents, and bombard shellhoppers the size of hablocks would sing their hymns of destruction directly onto the heretical stronghold, reducing its defiance to radioactive soup. While the Death Corps labored, sweat and ash caking their brows as they turned virgin waste into fortified hellpits, the enemy watched. From the bone-grey parapets of the Citadel Fortress, the followers of the apostate cardinal, their souls already marked, fortified themselves for the inevitable. Their corrupted cardinals, whispers phlegmy with promised salvation through defiance to false ideals, pulled nervous recruits from the terrified citizenry, shoring up skeletal troop rosters. The defenses, though potent symbols of heretical resolve, were crucially unfinished, weak seams punctuating the imposing structure. For the commanders poring over Auspex arrays in prefab command bunkers miles behind the front, this represented the first tangible fissure, a crack in the Citadel's ossified skull to exploit in the long, inevitable crawl towards damnation's core. The killing fields of Rax, vast and desolate, waited with patient malevolence. Artillery crews, priests of destruction clad in grime-stained fatigues, meticulously calibrated their behemoth weapons. Elevation dials spun with unhurried reverence, shell casings polished by calloused hands as sacred relics. The guns themselves, shrouded in camouflage netting that did little to conceal their terrible purpose, were aligned on fixed bases, their maws gaping hungrily towards the enemy lines. In their chilling shadows, infantry rhythmically drilled, bayonets flashing dully in the perpetual twilight that hung over the ashen planet. their features permanently obscured by rebreather filters and gas mask eyepieces, conferring a terrifying anonymity. The countdown pulsed with the dying breaths of the planet. Soon, the leaden silence would rupture. The first salvos would shudder across the wasted landscape, a symphony of screaming metal and pulverized rock, the bass roar of artillery heralding the birth of a war destined for carcass counts in the millions. At dawn on 166.83 M41, the void-cold silence of the barren morning was obliterated. A thunderous, catastrophic roar, vast beyond comprehension, erupted from the eastern horizon, the throat of the Creek Siege Park torn wide. Guns of truly astronomical caliber discharged their wrath, gargantuan shells arcing through the polluted sky like falling stars of pure malice, detonating with ground-shattering detonations amongst the fragile earthworks of the Veritan outer defenses. The planet itself convulsed under each titanic pulse. The radioactive wasteland soil heaved like a beast in agony. Ash plumes vomited skyward, choking the few shreds of visible sky, the air instantly saturated with the throat-searing, eye-burning tang of scorched propellant and pulverized rock. The infernal bombardment raged for hours beyond counting, a relentless torrent of high explosives raining down in a ceaseless drumbeat of destruction. Gun barrels, laboring under unimaginable stresses, glowed a threatening cherub, crews cadaverous figures in the flickering gunnery lights laboring with desperate haste to sustain the apocalyptic orchestra. The opening barrage rent the face of V's Prime, gouging monstrous, ragged craters into the unconsolidated ash that passed for soil, swallowing whole bunkers and emplacements, the distant keening cries of the mangled barely registering above the overwhelming din. Yet the defenders were not specters. From deep within their ferrocrete skulls, coiled in fortified battery nests amidst the ruins, the heretical artillery stirred. Basilisk self-propelled guns, their long barrels like accusing fingers pointed skyward, boomed their reply. Shells traced graceful, lethal parabolas high into the hazel-laden sky before plummeting earthwards like divine wrath amidst the ordered rows of Creek cannonry. The bombardment transformed into a monstrous duel, a grotesque contest of endurance and macabre skill between unseen artillerists leagues apart. Early heretic fire stuttered, shells falling wide, lost in the churning confusion of smoke and geysering earth. But grim acuity honed by desperation soon found its mark. At the sprawling complex dubbed Battery 413, a single, unerring shell kissed its target. The direct hit detonated an earthshaker cannon in a towering fan of incandescent flame and twisted plating, breaching nearby munition hoppers and triggering an apocalyptic secondary explosion that swallowed men and metal in a roiling storm of fire and fragmentation, a brief, bloody exclamation mark in the ceaseless thunder of the guns. Beneath this soaring canopy of death, the infantry of the Death Corps advanced. Clad in the engines of their trade, thick greatcoats weighed down with mud and particulate matter, breather masks turning each man into an anonymous ghoul drowning in acidic vapors, the soldiers of the 158th Regiment moved forward into the inferno. They advanced not with triumphant shouts, but in a deep, profound silence, a gray-black tide flowing inexorably over the lip of their forward trenches. Artillery shells, monstrous birds of prey shrieking overhead, burst in boiling clouds overhead, or plowed craters unsettlingly close, showering them in grit and bone fragments. But the guardsmen marched on with glacial inevitability. Their orders forbade the immediate, costly storming of the enemy positions. Instead, they dispersed across the ground, brutally rearranged by the guns, and began the soul-crushing labor of digging in. Spades bit into the churned, still-warm earth, scraping shallow hollows, foxholes mirrored depressions, offering scant shelter from the sporadic yet murderous fire. By the time the system's pallid primary star feebly cast its twilight glow, crudely linked positions were scratched into the battlefield, pitiful but vital sanctuaries sculpted from the vengeance of explosions. The work resumed uninterrupted the following dawn, an agonizing ballet of survival. Each isolated foxhole was painstakingly linked to its neighbor by shooting trenches, scraped deep enough that only the grim peaks of helmets showed above the parapet. These narrow arteries expanded, merging platoon positions, then swelled into broader company holdings as squad after squad consumed the porous earth. Under cover of nights vibrant with near misses and starshell starlight, razor wire teams crawled like beetles through the mud, unspooling evil coils of serrated metal before the nascent lines. Cruel, intricate labyrinths designed to tangle and gut impulsive patrols. Heavy weapons teams anchored themselves into firing pits, water-cooled barrels of autocannons spiked defiantly forward, lascannon arrays humming with charged power, all staring hungrily across the corpse-strewn emptiness christened no man's land. The soldiers dug with the agony of the damned, backs breaking, hands blistering and bleeding into wrapped grips, lungs burning from inhaled ash. Pinioned under the unending drumfire bombardment, the defenders gave little back. Sheltered within deep, ferrocrete-impregnated bunkers and angled strongpoints, they responded only with sporadic sullen fire, a sniper's round inevitably finding its mark with a damp thump, a mortar bomb erupting irregularly like boiling blood bursting through the battlefield's skin. They offered no significant resistance, these entrenched heretics. They merely watched with unseen eyes, observed the creeping fungal infestation of Imperial earthworks spreading strain by strain across the muddy slopes outside their killing zones. Between the two nascent armies now lay no man's land, a vast corpse-studded moonscape carved and recarved by high explosive, littered with tangles of razor wire, shattered rockreed, and the silent, cooling detritus of war, reeking of death and spent cordite, the emptiness within it pregnant with the terrible promise of annihilation. None yet dared venture deeper into its lethal calm. The apostate cardinal's minions had woven a sharp, complex necklace of despair around their sanctuary. Their positions, integrated deep into the volcanic bedrock and heavy with ferrocrete muscle, were designed to weather celestial bombardment. Earthen ramparts transformed into mountains, crisscrossed by tank-oblivion ditches and acres of cunningly laid mines lurking beneath the gray blanket ash like diseased burrowers. Giant grids of razor wire glittered evocatively under starshell blossoms, stretching endlessly. Peppered strategically within this layered death puzzle lay the strongpoints, veritable islands of concentrated resilience reinforced subterranean complexes capable, it was believed, of withstanding any siege ordnance the Imperium could hurl, while vomiting enfilades of heavy bolter fire to scythe any advance. These rout points, as cold tactical logic termed them, were the diseased teeth in the skeletal jaw of the outer defenses. The inevitable assault commenced on 212.813 M41. Relentless for 5 unbroken days and nights, the artillery barrage from the Death Corps' 21st Bombardment Corps had reshaped reality. No man's land ceased to exist as coherent territory. It churned like a colossal cauldron stirred by apocalyptic giants, a morass of liquefied ash, steaming mud oceans, and overlapping blast craters large enough to swallow tanks, the landscape unrecognizable beneath the ceaseless tirade of earthshaker roars and gun mortars pounding with insane, arrhythmic fury. The orchestrated cacophony, the brutal symphony of utter ruination, abruptly crescendoed gun barrels overheating, magazines expended crashing into a sudden, shocking, almost physical silence. In that vacuum of sound, charged with the visceral terror of anticipation, the battlefield itself seemed paralyzed. The order, ripped from vox sets almost lost in the ringing silence, snapped the tension. Advance, and the tide broke. The 149th Regiment launched itself over the shattered parapets towards the designated breach zone, Sector 4639, where fragile intelligence suggested the heretical skin was thinnest. On the flanks, site-correct yet unhesitating, the 143rd and 150th Regiments surged forward simultaneously, diversionary sledgehammers intended to draw heretical reserves like blood-sucking flies from the critical point. Behind them, drawn up and spoiling for carnage, the tracked beasts of the elite 11th Assault Corps idled deep stowage racks loaded with high-explosive promises, ready to exploit any rent torn by the infantry sacrifice. The first wave scrambled out, low-hunched forms already swallowed by the roiling haze and thick chemical fumes, figures rendered merely as shadows flitting against a bruised sky, fuming with the memory of detonations. They moved with the shocking discipline of guardsmen under annihilation, pairing through the devastated wasteland not at a run, but with a hideous metronomic marching gait despite the appalling toll, step a brutal step into the meat grinder. The heretics were far from annihilated. From deep shelters resonating like subterranean gongs, survivors clambered out, limbs pumping, fear transmuted by fanaticism into lethal rage. Blanketed firing slits suddenly erupted in machine gun flame, coughing long, lethal stutters that swept diagonally across the advancing lines, expertly sighted fires intersecting, mowing down entire files as they marched. Heavy artillery shells, terrifyingly precise, detonated amidst the ranks, not atmospheric blasts now, but methodical bursts precisely correlated with infantry movement, showering fused metal that shredded or vaporized bodies whole. Men literally ceased to exist, crumpled into rags, limbs separated abruptly, torsos blowing apart into red mist. Yet terrifyingly, impossibly, the Death Corps line drifted relentlessly forward, reforming gaps instantly sealed by ghostly figures emerging from the confusion of smoke, discipline the fragile remnant holding sanity together. For many, there was only open ground, no crater deep enough, no shell-shattered wreckage sufficient to offer sanctuary. They simply fell where they walked, convulsed by impacts, bodies mangled under high-velocity explosive debitage, the heavy coats offering paper resistance, the masks perhaps mangled on mangled faces. Some, seeking momentary slither of safety, plunged into craters still radiating heat from earlier shells, only to be caught by the plunging, deadlier fire of heretic mortars dropping bombs vertically into the watery grave. Officers, identifiable only by their bellowed commands over the roaring storm of munitions, gestured forward with pistols or power swords aglow, blasting exhortations no one could hear above the industrial cacophony of their demise, until abrupt silence claimed them too, voices erased by journeying shrapnel or a marksman's trigger pull. In the jump-off trenches, the second wave, their eyes glazed with suppressed dread behind scratched lenses, bayonets cold and heavy on lascarbines, watched their predecessors vanish into the haze, heard the dreadful percussion of killing, and waited their moment to flood into that pestilential zone. The second wave moved forward in the wake of the mangled first, picking their way over terrain now unrecognizable, slick with dark fluids, scattered with contorted forms still twitching or locked in death agony's comrades indistinguishable from foe in a coma of truant movement and burning metal. They advanced through a horror irrevocably worsened, the grenadier companies at their tip, encased in heavier carapace shells than the common infantry. Their heavier armor plates deflected glancing blows, perhaps absorbing the hammer impact of shrapnel that would have disemboweled a lesser man, but the ferocity of defender fire was obscene. Few made the final yardage to the enemy parapets. Those frantic survivors achieved momentary contact, hurling their cracked grenades in desperate arcs, following with the finality of fixed bayonets, leaping into the trench lines to grapple with silhouettes that lunged screaming from murder slits. But the heretics held, their defense cunning, overlapping fields of fire converging effortlessly on any point breached, limbs tangled instantly in dense razor wire coils waiting like hungry brambles behind the forward parapets, turning each hard-won gain into a killing bottle wholesale slaughter enacted at rifle range, obedient to intricate defensive choreography. By the fractured closing of that first sacrificial day, the hard arithmetic of annihilation shook even seasoned commanders. The 32nd Company of the 149th Regiment, a full battle fortress at dawn bearing 600 guardsmen, counted only 58 souls breathing at dusk fewer, than functioned as a single platoon commander's command. Night brought grotesque relief as titanic bombardment resumed somewhere behind, masking fainter sounds. The horrifying symphony of the wounded, trying to claw their way back towards the Imperial lines under searing starshell illumination, pitiful moans blending with the sporadic, vengeful volleys of snipers hunting crawling figures through magnified scopes. Some remained stranded, pinned immobile in craters filling rainwater bloodfall, trapped by the lethal geometry of overlapping fire lanes, bodies stiffening as cold seeped deep into burned flesh, their wound dressings long dissolved by slurry mud. Dawn on the second nightmarish day bled crimson across distorted hills. No mercy awaited the survivors. The third wave obeyed the command, surging onto the same waterlogged, corpse-clogged killing fields the first had painted red, retracing the precise avenues of destruction with robotic precision. Artillery thundered overhead once more, but the defenders, churning sludge over their parapets as they prepared fresh ammunition belts, repelled every renewed push, seemingly inexhaustible. The longed-for breach remained mythical. Reinforcements began filtering into the shredded enemy lines through underground tunnels engineered by Thrall engineers, gaps filled by fresh fanatics bearing the heat of the Cardinal's whispers. The Death Corps assaults might have ground to utter ruin had the heretics not revealed a fatal overreach. As the third day of mindless violence feathered the sky with unwelcome light, emboldened by Imperial exhaustion and casualty reports rippling through command scopes like cracks in glass, the defenders marshaled a counterattack. Haunches struggling over their own wire under tricky smoke breath screens, their reserve companies launched, driven by exorbitant psalms to shatter the mangled regiments clinging to the edges of the mudrown trenches. They charged with the fervor of zealots granted purpose extrinsically. But the Death Corps had prepared. Second-line trenches, constructed deeper and steadier during fleeting bombardments, were now honeycombed with dedicated voids bristling heavy weapons. Quadgun tracks thunderingly spooled ammunition belts thick as wrists into positions already zeroed precisely on advancing target vectors as taut as violin strings. Mortars hurled their arcing rain from positions swaddled in obscuring smoke haze kilometers behind. As wave after screaming wave of heretics swarmed onto the open ground, recently conquered Imperial territory, they found a prepared slaughterhouse instead of shattered demoralization. Autocannons raking lines as pliant as wheat, lasgun bursts vaporizing segments where groups bunched, heavy stubber tracers drawing invisible razor floss through masses of bodies. Sheets of high explosives from the supporting artillery park slammed down into the densely packed attackers like leaden gloves punching dough. It became self-sustaining carnage, the anticipated panacea transformed into colossal expenditure of heretic bodies, horrific countercharges bleeding themselves dry attempting and failing to dislodge retreating Imperial positions. They festooned the field with their own obscenely twisting forms, chest cavities airing backwards from violent impacts, mingled grotesquely with the blue-gray mounds of guardsmen slaughtered during preceding assaults. As the infected sun finally relinquished its weak grip on another cryogenic dusk leveling Planet V, the battlefield sank into temporary stillness, only punctuated by the gynecological sound of big guns methodically reshuffling positions. Sweeter, wetter silence crept like cyanotic frost through paused heatherland. Bodies stiffened slowly into indistinct elevations, marking each kilometer won and told. The outer defenses of racks remained obstinately, stubbornly unbroken. Stalemate solidified, calcifying the front lines in a freezing slurry of mud and entrails. This initial surge had bled the deathcore arteries alarmingly. Tens of thousands in dead guardsmen lay frozen in positions they'd reached before catastrophic suppression, sprawled in the colossal teethed fissures of no man's land or entombed in collapsed bunkers. Survivors chewed gritty nutrient paste and greasy synth proteins inside stinking, flooded burrows, the unwelcome knowledge gnawing beneath fatigue. This grim promenade across the blood-sodden field wasn't done. Many more assaults were inevitably scheduled, each a calculated effusion, each incurring a mandatory capital investment in blood measured by regimental marker flags pushed mere meters further into the corpse-littered morass. Fortune favored cruelty for Hill 453 during autumn 814 M41. Initially marking merely counting on giant strategic maps returning static arterial spur downhill, it ascended instead into engraved immortality, a week-long hellstorm of unremitting slaughter that fractured the unbreakable skin racks, proving the tactical hinge upon which the entire grinding outer defense bastion swung. 6 grinding, choking months of stagnation, pulsed by nothing significant save fidelity to the war machine's nutrition units, all culminating with the vital assignment of the 261st Regiment scraped together from multiple wrecked formations and attached to the remorseless anvil of the 30th Line Corps. Its task, probe the shifting defenses, find rotting flesh beneath impervious armor. Vital, yes, inhuman, cost inevitable. Eternity lingered consenting in sheer proximity. Like the reek gas mingling with expensive sweat beneath nested plate mail on doomed horizons, each indignity personally fresh along mismatched infantry boots, generating hypothetical avenues to escape unwanted amalgamation, imminent dizziness persistent despite explicit doctrinal implants purportedly assuring. Agitation crescendoed via orders servicing interminable numbers pulling salient vectors, required investing enforcement into sophisticated layers, impermeable structure Excelfield instrument medicine infantry, encountered temporarily adjunct settled close theater, positioning deadlocked corpse clusters, irrelevantly coordinated at distance, designed tomorrow forced injurious routes tangling denuded commands beneath jumbled armor assets warehouse. Continuations incubated absurdly held trench. Absolute necessities, forced allocation buttons etched fatally into command block displays, illuminating designs, primarily circumvented anticipated rebellion, replacing designated fallen commanders, restressing attentional strains, diffusing protocols, silently flapping parchment scroll, authorized treasured conduct-coded transmissions, bleeding recruit plenums, lashed training detachments, scheduled coordinating harmonic convergence advanced procedures. Anticipation peaked into. The constant, low thrumming of distant artillery provided the base rhythm against which the 9th Company moved. They were the chosen blade, Commander Tyok's grenadiers, tasked by the higher echelons of the Death Corps war machine with finding the artery to bleed the heretic defenses dry. Fort A453, a cyclopean slag heap of ferrocrete and despair, anchored the enemy's stranglehold, and cleaving it open was the designated purpose. For days preceding their assigned moment, the colossal siege guns of Craig hammered the approach, a concert of obliteration conducted with monstrous instruments. They tore the crust of Rax Primus apart, sculpting Naman's land into a desolate empire of craters, mud mirrors slick with rain and worse, its depths perfect graves for the unwary or unlucky. Smoke hung over it all like a funeral shroud, acrid and thick. Beneath this manufactured hellscape, hidden within the rolling banks of fumes and the deafening chaos of the final preparatory barrage, Tyok's men advanced. They were grim specters in the murk, gas masks like expressionless skulls, movements economical and purposeful. To cross that apocalyptic wasteland should have been impossible. The ground gasped beneath boots sticky with gruel-like mud. The skies rained random shrapnel and earth fountains from heretic counter-battery fire. Yet they moved forward with the implacable pace of automatons, their training overriding primal terror. Artillery screams detonated yards away, coughing up geysers of filth, gutting comrades instantly. Men vanished mid-stride, reduced to crimson mist or sprawled grotesquely, silenced. Still, the survivors pressed on. The very air choked them, the dense smoke banking visibility to mere feet, yet Tyok, through will honed in 1,000 drills, found the breach point. Signal flares arced briefly overhead from the smoking ruin that had been the enemy parapet the sign. A desperate, shrieking push ensued, bayonets clashing against flensing blades in the stinking confines of the trench, grenades hurled into machine gun nests just clearing a path. Victory wasn't a cheer, merely the cessation of resistance immediately around a heavy blast door. They declawed onto the dragon's flank at horrific cost. Inside the personnel shelter, the stench was overwhelming. Cordite, ozone, pooled blood, and human waste congealed into a physical miasma that coated the mask filters. The very rockcrete vibrated with the continuous percussion of artillery, a constant hammering heartbeat shaking dust loose, rattling bones. They were precariously perched, a single toehold in a universe bent on their annihilation. Retreat wasn't a word in Tyok's lexicon. He beckoned the sharpest, fleetest skeleton in his command. The runner knew the assignment: carry word of the purchase they'd secured to General Duran, far back in the command bunkers. Back across that infernal crucible of mud and death. The grenadier vanished into the smoke, a shadow swallowed whole. Hours bled away, measured only in the unceasing detonations shaking the shelter, the groans of the wounded, the methodical setting of grenade traps and auspex sweeps down dark corridors. The fate of Tyok's company hung in the razor-edged balance of a single man risking every sniper's scope and stray shell fragment. When the runner finally stumbled, ashgry and wittied, into Duran's presence, his message delivered in a bloody cough, the machinery of war ground into higher gear. Reinforcements, fresh, relentless grenadiers surged forward at first light, pouring into the gap the Ninth had bought with bone and blood. The fiery vengeance hurtled down the main arteries carved by Tyok, silencing heretic emplacements in showers of masonry and flaming fragments. Below, within the tomb-like intestines of Fort A453, Tyok's survivors were already locked in a different kind of hell. The tunnels were a claustrophobic nightmare, a maze hewn into bedrock by generations of toil, now echoing with shrieks and the thunderous bark of shotguns and bolt pistols at murderous proximity. Renegades fought with the cornered spite of vermin, knowing only extermination awaited. Flamers ghosted through pillar shadows, jets of superheated promethium washing over entire squads, roasting them inside their flak armor, filling the air with the nauseating smell of seared flesh and hair, a greasy smoke that clawed at lungs. Men perished silently, stifled within their masks, collapsing into glowing ash piles. Yet, like a remorseless machine, the death corpse pushed forward. Measured shots from lasguns stitched uniformically crimson trails down corridors, the harsh snap of their discharge swallowed by the caverns. Bayonets oiled and sharp slid into throats from behind collapsed rocks, withdrew stained to the hilt. Step by agonizing step, corridor by branching corridor, they bled the fort of its defenders. By the muddy dawn bleeding feebly through distant vents on the second day, they owned the central access artery, the vital vein permitting the Imperial steel tide to flood deeper. Fort A453 cracked wider. The third day heralded Imperial might unleashed without mercy. The ground above erupted anew. Earthshakers pounded designated targets into smoking flats. Then came the grinding, tectonic roar of tracked behemoths. 3 full companies of tanks from the 61st Craig Tank Regiment rolled toward the beleaguered fortification, slab-sided lemon russes and chimneys belching greasy exhaust. Among them, dwarfing them, a Baneblade Super Heavy advanced like a small, vengeful mountain, its gigantic barrel sweeping for targets with malign intelligence. Atlas excavators, scarab-like and ponderous, labored in their wake, dozer blades gouging paths through the splintered wreckage, filling ravenous tank traps with mounds of scrap and corpses. The tanks weren't silent gods, they were roaring instruments of annihilation. Cannons spoke with world-ending authority, turning reinforced bunkers into collapsing tombs of fire and ferrocrete, silencing machine gun nests with percussive finality. Infantry followed the steel avalanche, pouring into the gaps. Below, amidst the choking dust and gun smoke, the struggle entered its most brutal phase. The sheer desperation of the cornered heretics transmuted into suicidal frenzies. They would erupt from hidden crawlspaces, dying in whirlwinds of frag, hurl crude melta-bombs onto passing chimera treads, immolating themselves, and the unlucky crew within their critical distance, screaming prayers to false idols. Advancing Death Corps squads would find themselves momentarily entangled with Craig pioneers in the confusing labyrinthine dark, recognition flares hurrying skywards to avert fratricide in the muzzle flashlit chaos. But the will of Krieg was titanium. Tyok's anchors held. The securing signals flashed back constantly, artery secure. Bunker 7 cleared, resistance broken, Fort A453 fell. The capture of the fort proved the fatal lesion. The vast systems of trenches, bunkers, firing pits, and overlapping kill zones that had defined the heretical outer defenses for bitter years suddenly had a bleeding gash in their flank. Vast, gray-green waves of Krieg reinforcements, seemingly endless, flooded through the gap. Like a rotten structure bearing one too many fractures, the outer defensive network collapsed. Across vast sectors, positions were outflanked, isolated. Surrender attempts were bayoneted out of hand. Panic rippled through the heretic lines, their dread solidified into mindless flight. Cohesion dissolved into desperate groups scrambling backwards, seeking the imagined safety of the second line. The 8th Assault Corps, poised for exploit, drove deep into this ragged chaos, the tip of a gray spear relentlessly punching through the soft and collapsing tissue, rolling up positions from the rear with mechanical efficiency. Nowhere was fatal flight more ruthlessly punished than by the pursuing Death Riders of Krieg. Harriers emerged from the fog of war and dust, atop their bounding, snarling cybersteeds, ancient chain lances whirring like hungry insects. They swept through the shattered remnants of regiments, their hoofbeats an unholy drumbeat of doom, cutting down stragglers, charging isolated knots of resistance, turning retreat into a wholesale slaughter. Anything overtaken was trampled under iron-shod hooves or run through, the riders themselves grim monoliths impassive to individual pleas or screams. Every assaulted position, every overwhelmed pillbox faced annihilation. No emplacements were bypassed. The method was grenade saturation, through firing slits followed by deliberate fire teams advancing through the smoke. No prisoners counted. Within days, the outer defenses, that grim bastion of defiance against the might of the God Emperor's fury, was silenced beneath a blanket of cordite, fresh corpses, and Krieg regiment flags planted in the smoking ruins. Success, however, bore the sharp metallic tang of harsh sacrifice. The fort above was a broken crown, its tunnels below catacombs. Gray dunes of Krieg dead mingled with the broken ochre lumps of the heretics, clogging corridors, filling trenches where the mud turned thick with gore. The defenders didn't pause to tally the cost beyond munitions and manpower reserves. To stand amidst such carnage and lament was indulgence. Here, death was duty fulfilled, a sacred transaction completed, offering spent life to the distant eternity of Terra. The gaze of the living, bloodshot eyes behind scratched lenses, flickered only briefly over the mountains of grey-clad dead, witnessing not tragedy, but completion. Then they turned as one grinding machine, their gas mask lenses reflecting the smoking silhouettes of the towering second-line bastions ahead. Fort A453 was a hard-won victory, shattering the brittle outer rim. It was a pivotal fracture in the apostate cardinal's calcified shell, prophesying the inevitable collapse of the defenses anchored upon it. But Rax Primus was far from conquered. Beyond lay the second line taller, thicker, ravenous with fresh defenders and deeper entrenchments. Beyond that impossibly vast, the citadel itself, its cyclopean spires clawing at the polluted heavens like a tumor of heresy, casting its deep shadow across the kilometers of ruin they had just paid so horrifically to tread upon. The narrative of the siege, already written in rivers of carbonate mud mixed with blood, was about to descend into an even deeper, more suffocating darkness. After the grinding warfare simply to reach the second line, a pitch of fury born of stolen momentum and broken faith consumed the heretics. The crisis of the army's foiled advance began in the early months of 815 M41. Haunted by the panic retreat from the outer ring, forced to abandon the muddy grave of the old northern defenses now exposed like a Picatclean fossil, Ridge, the apostate cardinal's forces, had writhed backwards into their deeper, harder-shelled positions. They left behind desolate plains pulverized into gray powder, nothing but foundations and shell fragments embedded in crusted ash. The death corps of Crimea advanced into what they believed was new ground freed for assault. It was the open jaws of a trap. The first scarcely-noted warnings slithered into the stalled momentum of 255815 M41. The 19th Siege Regiment, part of the battered 1st Corps, had scraped out overnight positions in the sector 6053, tangle a wasteland heaped between the shattered remnants of the northern defenses now behind them and the looming massif of the second defensive line ahead. It wasn't enemy territory anymore, they thought. It was battered, smoking, pulped safe. Krieg sentries hunched on the firing steps that night, their senses stretched thin listening through the omnipresent rumble. Distant sounds teased the greasy air, a persistent low thrum that wasn't earthshakers, the metallic, rhythmically irregular grinding, tracks moving. Frantic Vox reports hissed with the suspicion's unseen shapes ghosting through the debris fields beyond the trenches. Command responded wearily. Harassing artillery fire sputtered into suspected areas, stalkings of shell impacts probing the darkness, brief flickers of light illuminating only shadows and shattered rockcrete. It achieved little beyond expending shells. The night passed dense with tension, unrewarded. At dawn, the regiment stood to as per the grinding rhythm of siege existence, scrambling along freshly dug scrapes, lasguns held over the parapets, night vision attachments crackling on auto senses, expecting perhaps probing lamers, maybe a brief infantry nuisance action, utterly unprepared for the monstrous storm they had enticed into position. First came the desultory rain of shells, a ripple of concussions slamming the earth, rattling the rifle butts, kicking dirt clods into faces behind masks, more a gesture of annoyance than intent. then the Earth vanished. It arrived without preamble overhead, a concentrated artillery impact of stupefying density. Not separate blasts anymore, but one continuous, overlapping roar like the sky itself ripping apart. High explosives crushed trenches flat, sent splintering timbers spinning like matchsticks in a gale. Just as shield reflexes clamped down, the camouflage miasma arrived. Dense white smoke shells exploded simultaneously, smothering the entire regiment's sector in an abrupt, blinding blanket. Sight vanished. Noise became the only reality, and within that thunderous universe, a new sound swelled like the opening gates of prophecy. A rolling metallic avalanche, the grinding din of 1,000 tracks converging, accelerating, punctuated by the sharp crump of main battle cannon firing point-blank demolisher shells into the smoke bank. Wham, wham, wham. Heavily armored shapes materialized out of the chaos directly on top of the forward trenches. Hebler variant lemon rust tanks painting with shells. They crashed through earthworks already crumpling from the barrage, crushing men like beetles under their treads, machine guns stitching spitting fire along the parapet positions. Explosions convulsed along crag positions, sending men and their sandbags skyward in organic clouds. Before the survivors could choke back screams or properly aim their lasguns, swarming up from churn craters and rents torn by the tanks, came the wave. A seething mass of Gevasa traitor militia poured through the breaches like rancid water, released incoherent shrieks on their lips. They had patchwork flak armor salvaged from dead Kriegarns, wielding stubbers belching slugs, crudely forged blades flashing in the encroaching firelight, brutish power axes cleaving downwards. Their charge wasn't discipline. It was pure, frantic malice launched on the impetus of the steel tide, smashing the defenses open. Lasgun volleys spat disciplined defiance from the trenches that still held. Heavy bolters mounted on tripods traversed arcs, scything through the leading ranks, turning them into pulped meat gatherings. But still they came, scrambling over the churned earth, over the bodies of their own fallen like vermin swarming offal. It was enough to drown individual courage in a tsunami of bodies plunging into the trenches. Colonel Adele, stationed at a cluster of deeper bunkers designated regimental command post, watched the catastrophe unfold through periscope lenses scored by flying grit. Smoke and dust choked all visibility beyond flickering shapes illuminated by tank flares or bursts of munitions. The Voxnet screamed incessantly, a litany of loss and frantic pleas cratering any illusion of order. Position Gamma 7 overrun. Tanks in the trench. Enemy infantry swarming. Beta 2 need reinforcements. Communication to Delta cut. Heavy enemy walker sighted. He saw the flanks crumbling. Tanks in Krieg Grey being caught turning slowly in the confined alleys of the trench network, assaulted by swarms climbing on their hulls, plasma pistols firing point-blank into vision ports. The enemy tide crashed relentlessly, washing against the defensive rocks only to surge around. Pressure mounted. He ordered his reserves forward. Seasoned grenadiers fed piecemeal into flaming breaches. Pleas to higher command for additional forces met grim silence. The 19th was stretched across a leaking dike alone, and every other regiment was already committed elsewhere. The day descended into a gray nightmare. Loyalist and traitor forces mixed horrifically as tanks shoving past obliterated landmarks separating platoons. Quad launcher positions overrun were ruthlessly turned against their former masters by jubilant heretics until the ammunition bins ran dry on carnage painted in Krieg Grey and traitor ochre. Slowly, insidiously, position by position crumbled under sheer weight and ferocity. By clutching twilight, no formal frontline remained. Instead, Sector 6053 became a writhing archipelago of isolated firefights amidst oceans of shifting enemy forces. Men fought back-to-back in shell craters serving as final redoubts, litanies of hate recited over vox channels choked with static as they emptied power packs. Regiment cohesion ceased to exist. Only desperate knots of Krieg frantically signaling their position remained like candles guttering out violently one by one in the murk. Colonel Adele fought beside them. Come dawn, the first wash of a hopeless morning revealed the abyss. He stood in a shallow communication trench transformed into a charnel house, bodies stacked as awful sandbags just to maintain firing lines. Heavy bolter teams smoked quietly where they'd died, covering retreats that couldn't occur. His own lasgun was slick with mud and carbon scoring. Wave after ragged wave came, scrambling over the pulped dead, screaming incoherent promises of torture if captured. Reports barely filtered through the chaos. Positions left and right annihilated in the night surge. His command was now an isolated debris pile besieged at its base. Communication lines beyond tactical nets were silent. Lieutenant Colonel Den, his stalwart deputy who'd been feeding fractured Vox reports, vanished suddenly as a lemon rust demolisher round punched into their central command dugout, pulverized rockcrete and vaporized Voxcasters marking where command infrastructure existed seconds before. Dell stood amidst his remaining men, 80 grim phantoms encircled in an ocean of iron-gray smoke and screams. Their power cells were running low. casualties mounting with each renewed heretical push bouncing off the shifting piles of dead. Adel made his calculus in seconds. Retreat into the enemy storm slashing at their barricades was impossible death. But someone had to carry appallingly accurate warning of this monstrous counterpunch, lest regiments beyond perished similarly unaware. Despair was alien to him. Grim necessity drove the choice. He issued orders. A decimated platoon would attempt a fighting breakout towards friendly lines, running the gauntlet through enemy infantry swarms. Adel himself and the men too wounded to sprint fast enough would form the stand, the wall, to delay, to buy minutes snapped from the grinding teeth of annihilation with their carcasses. The rear guard accepted grimly. The breakout group vanished into the smoke-dense crater maze, immediately vanishing beneath a hail of small arms fire audible only moments above the thunder. Adel snapped power cells into his rifle, sharing his pitifully small stock of cracked grenades amongst the grim panting figures around him. They knew the pact they'd made. By time, the enemy came again, howling their desperate catechisms. Lambasts barked cut-down tightly packed gevesses wading through their own dead. Bayoneted counterattacks drove minor breaches momentarily shut. Adel fought like a machine, his voice calm, clipped targeting orders over the regimental vox frequency that no one else likely heard, the only thing momentarily holding their sliver of hell together. But it couldn't last. It was geometry, attrition, physics grinding inevitable. Reports whispered of movement probing their rear. They were encircled entirely. Then came the ghastly howl, a rising scream building over the thunder. Adel turned. Hurrying through gaps created by an intensifying tank barrage came the Predator Death brought low, a Hellhound assault tank, its Promethium tanks bulging malignantly under the turret line. Its multimelta nozzles swung towards their desperate survivors piled behind crumbling barricades. Time stretched brittle. Adel saw the pilot light flare sapphire into the murk. He uttered a final curt order: stand firm. Hideous order fulfilled authority. Immense, roaring dawn erupted. A torrent of burning chemical vengeance jetted 80 feet, liquid orange-white annihilation enveloping Colonel Adel and his last Kriegarns instantly. The Promethium sheeted their position, swallowing desperate silhouettes writhing like beetles before collapsing into pyres-consumed fuel-sourced fury. There was no lingering scream, merely a monstrous woof as superheated air displaced cooler remnants. Minutes later, the fiery hell died, revealing charred black stalks where men once stood fused to slagged rockcrete. Adel's command post an indistinguishable pile of glowing cinders spitting molten metal. Heres plodded forward through the wreckage unimpeded, crunching cinders like snow. Of Adel and his legacy annihilated utterly, his parameters established their tools brutal and exacting this trap. The consequences rippled outward with seismic intensity. The annihilation of the 19th Siege Regiment wasn't defeat, it was evisceration. Over 80,000 men consumed in the fiery Moloch dead disappeared into the heretical bowels, or fleeing incoherently into the ash wastes never to reign. The singular purpose they represented vaporized. The meticulously planned second-line assault imploded instantly. Heretical forces poured unstoppable momentum into the vast hole the regiment once occupied. The entire Craig First Corps, already fractured by weeks of grinding pressure, found itself violently unmoored. Local command emplacements were overrun before word disseminated. Entire sections found their flank exposed simultaneously. Orders became garbled panic, cohesive resistance fractured, chaos bloomed. The Corps imploded into emergency mode, salvaged the line. Anything capable depleted squadrons from the 7th Tank Regiment, bloodied knights of the Death Rider companies, already so thin they operated in squad units, were flung like gravel into the path. Roads leading backwards became vital arteries, clogged desperate counterattacks aimed not at victory, but gaining precious hours, allowing artillery park withdrawals, bolstering crumbling deeper defenses. Scattered infantry remnants reformed under nearby commissars, their shovels digging desperate breastworks, while their lasguns held advancing heretic scouts at bay. Chimeras and basilisks hurriedly evacuated burning supply dumps ignited by infiltrator squads. It was stark, brutal rearguard action. War reduced to minutes bought with fresh armor scarred into flanking ambushes, surges rust smashing into columns, insistent gevasa tearing into crew hatches. Lithe and duck diving behind burning wrecks, holding a crossroads for slower detachments retreat. Oblivious Death Riders launching whistling charges down traverse lanes into advancing tank flanks, delaying infantry envelopment seconds counted again, shelling bought moment. Claw's bleeding hours purchasing meter, whilst kilometers stripped north behind them lapsed into enemy torrent control bleeding, was slow extracted, toll armor couldn't withstand forever brutal sacrifices, inflicted grievous wounds, hemorrhaging tanks, flaming Gevasa bodies, mountains accumulating below the second line wall, advancing steam, inexorable defied days, blazing ruins, accumulated trackways, coolant boiled vile greases, surrendered skeletons, blackened continent halt, found early 4th day. Breaking sheer weight, allied iron grind slowed steel, aligned deeper defenses, thickened ashen soil, solidified advance, petered out, bled momentum. Exhausting 3 days facing mounting corps pay cost, coerced withdrawal, chaotic reshuffling territory fort, a 453 paid fort, now traded quarry conquering fingernails, scratching the eternal fortress face, cheaply bought illusions, shattered burden, bestowed the astral CD rumble, proceeded on racks reminding mankind paces, caught breath, then spade bayonet fixed. Resumed the construction's fortified despair eternal, there would be no headlong rush, no grand, final gamble born of desperation. Instead, with that same implacable rhythm that defined their existence, the soldiers of Krieg bent once more to their task. Spades bit into the churned, corpse-laden earth, carving a complex lattice of trenches and fortifications that inched, yard by deadly yard, closer to the heretical lines under the rattling canopy of their own artillery fire. The Van Mierland wastes transformed, day by grinding day, into a sprawling, nightmarish labyrinth etched in mud and viscera, an eternal testament to the grim, stoic persistence of the Emperor's chosen. Years bled into the void. On the cold dawn of 128.816 M41, the 88th Siege Army, as if governed by some unalterable mechanical clockwork, committed itself again to the offensive. The prelude was familiar, a world-shattering barrage that reduced the defiled ground to a churning, smoking ocean of craters. Then came the order, echoing through voxhorns coated in frozen mud. 6 entire regiments surged forward in unison, their movements synchronized, precise, robotic. They hurled themselves against the tangled webs of heretic trenches, log-reinforced bunkers weeping rust, and coils of gleaming, blood-encrusted razor wire, with that same relentless forward momentum that had propelled them this far into hell. But the enemy, steeped in the same grim calculus of siege warfare, was prepared. Across most stretches of the mangled front, the Imperial assault fed upon itself beneath the hammer blow of defensive fire. Entire companies simply ceased to exist, obliterated within moments, their bodies piling into grotesque, steaming mounds amidst the freshly pulverized earth of the burgeoning no-man's land, slumped or contorted where the charge had faltered and died. Here and there, like a fist punching bloody knuckles through rotten cloth, the attackers gained fleeting purchase, seizing shattered sections of enemy trench or a collapsed strongpoint. Yet even these brief islands of apparent victory proved tragically ephemeral, mirages dissolving in the smoke. The heretics pivoted instantly, their own artillery thundering down with lethal precision, tearing through the newly won, isolated scrapes of earth. Crucified by their own advance, cut off, the attackers were swiftly overwhelmed, slaughtered where they stood or driven back in broken fragments towards their own ravaged lines, leaving behind only the fading screams and the silent dead. The battle ebbed and flowed like some macabre tide upon a corpse-strewn shore, each wave of Krieg infantry crashing with lethal predictability against the apostates' defenses only to recede minutes later, ground down by blistering counterthrusts. Gains were negligible, measured in yards torn from the mud rather than glorious miles, counted not in victories but in body counts tallied under flickering lamplight. Yet day after grim day, the corps commanders issued the same terrible orders, dispatching fresh waves of gray, cadaverous soldiers into the grinder. Each assault was a precise, horrific echo of the last, a soul-crushing loop of sacrifice repeated over countless months. Hundreds of such attacks were launched, each inevitably left behind its pitiless toll of the dead, the limbless, and the sanity-shattered, feeding the monstrous appetite of the siege. One more planetary year cycled into oblivion, and the stalemate held, a malignant tumor festering upon the planet's surface. Far north, where the relentless pressure of the First Corps pressed like a slow, inexorable glacier, change, though agonizingly gradual, registered anew. Reinforced by replacements shipped from Krieg's Foundry World bowels, their intricate networks of trenches crept infinitesimally closer to the enemy positions. Their massed artillery batteries, never truly silent, continued their grim work with terrifying patience, reducing the heretics' makeshift shelters to splinters and molten slag. The ground surrendered in harrowing retreat months prior was won back inch by corpse-littered inch, though it demanded half a year of bloody toil to reclaim what had been lost in a single, chaotic week of the enemy's initial violent counteroffensive. By that desolate year's end, the First Corps stood once more before the jagged teeth of the vaunted second line. The skeletal, irradiated ruins of Hab 1 sprawled like a gutted beast behind them, its prefabricated carcass utterly obliterated by months of relentless, unceasing bombardment. The war itself seemed to ossify, settling into a dreadful, hypnotic rhythm composed of the ceaseless thud of entrenching tools, the distant rumble-tashrik of artillery duels, and the vicious staccato of constant patrol clashes across the corpse-choked wasteland. For weeks on end, the front remained seismically static, transformed into a quagmire of mud, water-filled craters, and dissolving corpses, where even the smallest shovelful of territory exacted a price measured in rivers of blood and mountains of shattered men. The corps commanders dreamed, night after fitful night, of a decisive rupture, a single, clean blow that would shatter the heretics' spine. But the brutal reality facing them was attrition, pure and unadulterated. They waged a war that consumed men and materiel with the indifferent veracity of a planetary furnace. A campaign that seemed destined only to devour all resources sent its way in an endless cycle of destruction. This unyielding grind, this horrific microcosm of the Imperium's wider, galaxy-spanning agony, was the reality of the battle for Sector 5045. Just when despair threatened to congeal into fatalism, a sliver of operational hope pierced the gloom on 649818M41. The 158th Regiment committed grenadier squads to a night raid, a move born of cold calculation and colder necessity. Capture and obliterate a vital enemy defense laser silo, a key component protecting Rax's skies from orbital interdiction. To preserve the fragile element of surprise, the preliminary bombardment was tailored, precise, a scalpel instead of a sledgehammer as darkness cloaked the scarred land. The Grenadiers began their perilous journey across Nomansland, their dark uniforms and close-fitting masks rendering them near-invisible wraiths slithering through the lunar landscape of overlapping shell holes churned to viscous soup by endless rain and blood. Progress was agonizingly deliberate, a crawl through a graveyard of the frozen fallen, each muscle screaming against the sucking mud. Without warning, a flare would stab upwards, detonate with silent fury, flooding the desolation with livid, blinding light that froze the crawling figures, pinning them down like grotesque sculptures amidst the corpses whose limbs mimicked their prone forms. Despite their mask-filtered discipline, their whispering moves, fate betrayed them. An enemy patrol materialized like phantoms from the darkness. A sudden muzzle flash, a choked scream abruptly silenced the brief, vicious firefight that erupted was over before the spent casings hit the mud, but the damage was irrevocable. The alarm shrieked through the heretic trenches. The Grenadiers reached the serpentine coils of razor wire surrounding the silo complex. Another flaring star shell unveiled their shapes starkly against the silhouette of the massive installation. A sentry, eyes wide with terror and recognition, howled the alert. Shouted curses and frantic commands ripped through the night air, rallying the defenders. Heavy bolters began spitting their lethal defiance, tracers flashing in garish streaks through the gloom. The night exploded into bedlam. Deafening gunfire mingled with the detonation of cracked grenades attempting to breach the wire. Thick black smoke, acrid and eye-watering, drenched the silo vicinity, fractured only by the stuttering epileptic flicker of muzzle flashes, revealing glimpses of frantic shadows grappling in the inferno. Under relentless pressure, the Grenadiers hacked desperately at the wire, breaching it at terrible cost, hurling themselves forward in a final, savage charge towards the silo entrances, knowing hesitation meant obliteration. The blast-proof structure became a vortex of shrieking death, a monstrous reverberating drum filled with shrapnel and men dying in desperate claustrophobic slaughter. Dawn began its gray, unforgiving creep across the horizon, illuminating a scene of utter devastation. Recognizing the critical moment, assembled corps commanders threw infantry companies into the deepening chaos, ordering a full battalion assault to rescue or reinforce the dwindling Grenadiers. But the initial assault had failed its primary objective. The silo's automated defensive arrays and cruisive positions remained brutally active. The fresh attack dissolved before it could coalesce. Nomansland east of the silo became a charnel house within minutes, the ground littered with the burning, twisted wreckage of Gorgon transports and scores of infantrymen slaughtered meters beyond their own trench lines, their advance cut down like grotesque hay. The raid ended in soul-crushing disaster. The laser silo stood unbowed, its deadly aperture gleaming dully in the ash-filled light. Of the elite Grenadiers who spearheaded the assault, pitifully few crippled survivors struggled back to friendly lines. The majority lay silent upon the hateful razor wire, tangled corpses festering amidst glinting steel barbs, or worse still, were dragged struggling into enemy custody as trophies. Those captured alive endured tortures so unspeakable as to make death a mercy, an end finally granted to their broken husks only after agonizing days of interrogation. Their lifeless, mutilated bodies were then mounted like obscene warnings on the wire, macabre totems swaying gently in the toxic breeze. By 820 M41, the siege of Vrax Priam had consumed 7 long, bitter years. Each passing day carved its cost into the very spirit of the beleaguered Imperial forces, etching despair where once flickered optimism. Lord Commander Zuelskaya, orchestrating this ponderous doomdance from the distant, pristine sanctuary of Thracian Primaris, felt the weight of Segmentum High Command's displeasure like chains tightening around his neck. The insatiable demands of the Adeptus Administratum pressed down like a suffocating blanket, whispering the lie he desperately needed to hear: more men. More regiments, this will tip the scales. A hopeful, perhaps futile petition snaked its way through the impossibly convoluted arteries of the Departamento Munitorum, Fresh legions of Krieg's unyielding soldiery were summoned from the crucible of their birthworld. Yet even Zweiskaya, cocooned far from the mud and the blood, knew the laggardly transit times meant precious months, perhaps years, before they arrived. Time itself felt weaponized against him, a resource ever dwindling, a luxury violently denied to both sides as the siege's monstrous weight ground planets into dust. Then came missives colder than the void itself, reports clutched in shaking hands by his adjutants, casting a chilling, deeper shadow over the campaign's bleak stagnation. The previously assessed defenders, presumed stretched beyond breaking, weakening day by grim day, offered no such comfort. They had in fact surged terrifyingly in strength. Not with rattling militia, but monsters from the darkest stars. The Alpha Legion, dread artificers of chaos undivided, had descended upon Vrax. Their arrival, cloaked in sorcerous misdirection, had slipped past even the Imperium's watchful celestial eyes, unnoticed like a poison seeping into a wound. Led by the infamous heretic Astartes Lord Arcos the Faithless, their sleek battle barge Anarchy's Heart, penetrating the Vraxian system under arcane concealing shields, void presence masked from the vigilant Imperial fleet patrols. Masquerading with blasphemous perfection as loyal sons of the Emperor, Arcos' warriors utilized their legendary skill at infiltration to bypass all cordons, arriving at Vrax Prime's primary starport and seamlessly blending into the apostate Cardinal's disparate forces beneath a veneer of purported loyalty. Their presence first manifested not in intelligence briefings, but in raking bolt gun fire, in the thunder of ceramite boots crushing Krieger skulls. In Sector 5249, the 261st Regiment, supported by the hulking bulk of Gorgon assault transports, had miraculously clawed out a foothold, punching a credible breach in the formidable second-line defenses. A fragile spark of optimism ignited momentarily among the command bunkers deep below Vrax's tortured surface. The counterattack that surged forth was unlike anything witnessed in 7 years of brutal attrition. It bore no resemblance to the fanatical human waves. It was delivered with chilling speed and supernatural ferocity by figures encased in skeins of dark blue ceramite, adorned with deceptive Hydra symbolism, appearing instantly amidst the fray. The ponderous Gorgons, vital anvils for exploitation, were ripped apart from within by close combat weapons and plasma fire, their blackened, gutted carcasses lying amidst the craters like metal behemoths murdered. The breach slammed shut with crushing finality. Once more the corpse faltered, choking on the dust of destruction raised not by men, but by angels become demon. Unbeknownst to the entire hierarchy of the 88th Siege Army, Vrax had mutated into a deadly lure, its protracted agony and oceans of spilled Imperial blood acting as an irresistible psychic beacon to the servants of the warp. At the heart of the apostate's defiant citadel in Vrax Prime, Arcos the Faithless stood before the bloated Cardinal, offering his legions unholy aid in the name of dark gods worshipped without reservation. His proposition resonated with cruel practicality. Where the Cardinal's ragtag militia floundered with zeal over discipline, the Alpha Legion offered peerless expertise in sabotage and infiltration, nuanced terror tactics beyond human ken. Their superhuman physique, relentless endurance honed by millennia of betrayal, and unwavering devotion to their dread masters brought an unprecedented lethality to Vrax's defense, a lethality far exceeding the crude violence wielded thus far. Arcos himself, a mind forged in deceit by centuries of warfare against the Imperium he despised, represented a tactical quantum shift. Under his chillingly competent direction, the Vraxian defenders began morphing. Their static trench network solidified and deepened. Their counterattacks evolved into orchestrated symphonies of murder, precision ambushes, replaced brute frontal resistance. The Alpha Legionaries threw themselves into their blasphemous task with chilling relish, their contempt for the servants of the Emperor palpable and profound, their joy only deepened by the spreading tendrils of despair among the besiegers. For the Hydra, Vrax was a sacrifice inscribed upon the altar of ruin, an unparalleled opportunity to bathe in the carnage of the Emperor's favored gatekeepers and earn the dark boons of their patrons. Yet the arrival of Arcos' warriors heralded a far more ancient, visceral horror. Nestled among the ranks of warriors were twisted acolytes steeped in forbidden lore chaos sorcerers. These malefic psyker lords, granted terrible powers by demons lurking in the Immaterium, sent a psychic beacon screaming into the Empyrean, a clarion call of slaughter that echoed across parsecs. It was a siren song of promised carnage and unchained plunder, vibrating through the cursed sea of souls, piercing the roiling madness of the Eye of Terror itself. From that cancerous rent in reality, legions of horrors stirred the eternal armies of the dark gods heard the call, flickering eyes turning with malicious intent towards Vrax, drawn irrevocably to the scent of renewed slaughter on a planet steeped already in 7 years of sacrificial gore. The news struck Zweiskaya's command like a physical blow transmitted through surly astropaths. The Alpha Legion's discovery alone was a strategic calamity, dooming conventional assault plans to predictable meat-grinding failure. But intelligence confirming the psychic beacon actively summoning more ruinous powers was apocalyptic, a vision of catastrophic defeat unfolding like a slow detonation. Suez's pre-existing campaign framework collapsed into strategic tatters. The fundamental calculation of the stalemate, already a heavy burden draining sector reserves, twisted into a horrifying specter, a quagmire deepening into an abyss capable of swallowing entire Imperial armies whole. For the rank-and-file soldiers of the Death Corps, weathering this fresh tempest of cosmic horror, the shift in enemy capability registered purely as another lethal variable demanding confrontation. They met the metamorphosed threat with the same bleak stoicism that defined their service since landing in this purgatory. They would fight, as they always had fought, against this gravest incarnation of heresy. The Alpha Legion injected an insidious, treacherous poison into the familiar brutality. Sabotage crippled supply columns deep behind Imperial lines. Artillery parks vanished in balls of plasma fire struck pinpoint from clandestine observers. Ambushes materialized with lethal precision from positions declared secure only hours prior. Potent demolition charges eviscerated command bunkers precisely at midnight briefings. The Greyclad soldiers found themselves battling not merely an entrenched, fanatical foe, but a shadow enemy capable of phantomic attacks, turning the very fog of war solid with niffied malice. Yet for all their superhuman dread potency and chilling intellect, even the corrupted veterans of millennia aboard the Hydra starship could not fundamentally shift the bedrock resolve of Krieg. They could compound the horror, escalate the casualty lists, bleed the attackers whiter still, but they could not break them. The war, elevated in savagery but grimly recognizable, ground on, consuming lives at an even greater pace. M40-1821 brought tangible succor amidst the escalating nightmares. Zhuelskaya's distant pleas, bolstered by deft political bartering and sheer necessity, finally manifested. The 46th Line Corps, fresh regiments shipped directly from Krieg, disembarked from groaning orbital transports onto Vraxian soil. Their uniforms less stained, their shovels still gleaming, these true sons of the blasted homeworld brought a stark counterpoint and tangible lift to the exhausted siege army drained manpower finally replenished. Yet this arrival, significant as it was, paled beside interventions Zhuelskaya did not orchestrate, tactics he was kept ignorant of through long-standing tradition. The Lord Commander Militant of Segmentum Obscurus, apprised independently of Vrax's escalating peril, the impossible Hydra head rising amidst the grinding corpse advance took action beyond mere troop rotation. He sought champions capable of the impossible. His pleas penetrated cloister citadels drifted through the void in mobile mountain fortresses. Answering the call, amidst others sworn to secrecy, came the First Legion themselves, the Dark Angels. Renowned for their implacable nature and millennia-long fealty, their massive fortress monastery, the Rock, pierced the Vraxian system like a blade drawn silent from shadow. It carried Supreme Grand Master Azrael, and the terrifying, concentrated might of over half the entire chapter's remaining Astartes. Their arrival possessed a gravity beyond mere reinforcement. It was the settling of a predator onto the planetary surface, the gathering bulge of a storm front before the killing lightning descends. Azrael exchanged no pleasantries with Zhuelskaya, offered no coordination with the core command structure. The Dark Angels moved with accustomed independence, vaulting over tenebrous chains of command as mere obstructions. Their focus bypassed entirely the stagnant, brutal attrition consuming the trenches like a primordial sucking bog. Azrael's keen, detached gaze settled not on the massed infantry battles scarring the wastelands, but southwards towards a prize neglected in the heretics' confidence. The primary starport nestled under the shadow of the Abos Hills. This vital logistics hub, the main artery sustaining the apostate cardinal's resistance, feeding his forces men and munitions rested across the chaotic warp currents, had been virtually overlooked defensively. Protected only against the threat it perceived distant trench lines garrisoned by Krieg infantry, constitutionally incapable of rapid maneuver warfare, not against deep-striking, teleporting fear. Its fixed defenses were sparse, understaffed, complacent through years of improbable safety deep in their own hinterlands. This fatal blind spot was the Fisher Azrael's strategic genius aimed to exploit. Thunderhawk gunships and screaming drop pods, like the vengeful falling stars of gods outraged, descended upon the calcified mudflats flanking the starport as orbital assets deployed finite but overwhelming firepower to suppress sparse flak emplacements. Within scant, brutally efficient hours, a formidable strike force assembled from the Voidborn reinforcements consolidated outside the starport perimeter. Their target the chaotic lifeblood pumping directly into the monstrous heart of the Vrax rebellion. The choked silence of the Cerna flats shattered under the grinding roar of approaching war machines. Tongues of dust, centuries deep, swirled into a gritty fog as columns of rhinos and land raiders advanced with dreadful purpose. Supremacy Grand Master Azrael stood rigid in the lead raider's cupola, his gaze fixed on the distant starport spires. Cutting the causeways was essential, sever the lifelines strangling the embattled defenders. Yes, but crucially for the First Legion, force the heretics to divert strength. It created an opening, a weakness, a possibility. For now, scouring reports spoke of the Alpha Legion slithering onto these battlefields. Alpha Legion. The name resonated deep within the ossified vaults of Azrael's being. Where the Alpha Legion slithered, whispers of the fallen so often followed those tainted brethren, whose eternal hunt defined his chapter's shadowed existence. The chance, however faint, however perilous, to claw back a fragment of forbidden knowledge kindled a fire colder than the surface of Fenris beneath his unwavering resolve. The presence of the faithless himself, arrows, it was an omen, a taunt, an enticement reason enough for blood. Prayer steeled purpose, turning conviction to bone-deep certainty. They would have the starport. They would crush the heretics. They would find the truth hidden in the Alpha Legion's lies. Lightning swift and utterly silent until the moment they struck, the dark angels fell upon the causeway defenses. Thunderhawks materialized from the sun-blasted haze above, unleashing streams of lasbolts and missiles, the impacts hammering the unprepared garrison positions, transforming machine gun nests into fountains of fragmented rockcrete and pulverized flesh. Before the echoes faded, assault marines erupted from the gunships, grav chutes flaring like angry stars, descending onto the roadway's eastern flank with chainswords already roaring to unholy life. The defenders' scattered, bleeding cries lost in the shriek of engines and weapons broke. Some threw down their lasguns mere heartbeats before the power-armored wrath consumed them. Others turned blindly to flee only to be ripped apart. Their attempts at resistance were brittle things, born of primal fear, not hope, snuffed out with the brutal, silent efficiency of the stoic Astartes. Blood slicked the dry, ancient stones, dark and steaming. While the assault squads secured their bloody foothold, the hovering Thunderhawks pivoted, their heavier munitions finding the central checkpoint. Cracked missiles slammed home, turbolacers punched through ferrocrete, and the heavy structure disintegrated, great chunks cascading into the fathomless ravine below like tumbling tombs. Into the chaos, relentless as the tide, tactical squads disembarked from advancing transports. Bolters snarled in controlled bursts, disciplined lines advancing with a rhythmic precision that brooked no defiance, driving the shattered remnants before them. Hemmed in, no salvation from the heavens, crushed between hammer and anvil, the causeway garrison ceased to exist in moments, reduced to cooling meat amidst the molten, slagged remnants of their positions. Azrael's orders cut through the vox. The causeway had to be rendered an impassable gap wound into the world's skin. Devastators deployed menacingly, their heavy weapons trained down its remaining length even as the tacticals fell back. The telltale tremor announced approaching reinforcements long before their heat-distorted shapes wobbled into view on the far flats. The lead tank scarcely registered before vaporizing into a secondary explosion as a lascannon found its volatile heart. The following column dissolved into sluggish confusion, vehicles swerving blindly, halting stalking prey for missile teams waiting with infinite patience. Cracked warheads arrowed in, overloading shield generators, melting treads, liquefying crew compartments. Lascannons vaporized hull plating. Mere minutes later, the causeway was a graveyard of blackened skeletons. Lemon rust carcasses fused to chimeras smoldering like funeral pyres, the air rich with the sweetser scent of cooked flesh and scorched promethium. Simultaneously, assault marines moved with grim purpose, scaling the tortured metal girders beneath the causeway's belly, planting multimelta charges against critical support pillars melded over millennia. The Thunderhawks returned, hovering beasts disgorging their kill teams once more. As the last assault marine crossed the threshold, boots thudding on steel decking, Orion activated the detonation signal. Percussive thump chain reacted down the line, a series of monstrous detonations that tore the ancient stone and metal supports like paper. The causeway emitted a tortured metallic scream, sagging violently before collapsing into the void below, dragging screaming defenders and mountains of debris into an eternal darkness. An immense pall of dust billowed upwards, a burial shroud settling over a new wound gouged into Cerna's face. By dusk, every major causeway feeding the starport had suffered identical fate, leaving its garrison severed, abandoned, facing the monstrous wrath of the Adeptus Astartes utterly alone. Cutting through the choking fog of pulverized rock and drifting ash, Azrael's armored spearhead ground inexorably forward, reaching the fractured sprawl marking the starport outskirts. Stench was overwhelming, the ozone bite of heavy weapons fire, mingling acridly with the thick, cloying reek of vaporized promethium, all underscored by the raw metallic taint of freshly spilled blood hot on the dry air. rhinos tracks ground over twisted wreckage, land raiders shoved aside shattered enemy armor, the relentless grind a pestle against the mortar of heretic resistance. Precise bolter fire silenced scattered pockets still foolish enough to raise a weapon. The scent of prey was thick now. Then squawked across the Vox Ravenwing outriders skirmishing at the edges, buzzes of stolen data, movement. An armored column attempting to punch southwards from the main starport defenses, perhaps seeking to counter-encircle, perhaps simply fleeing. Azrael directed the covering Thunderhawks skyward. Invisible until their first devastating strike, they pounced on the desperate enemy column emerging from the swirling haze. Underwing launchers spat missiles that connected, transforming the lumbering shapes into sudden suns that ignited fragile armor. One chimera, struck amidships, vanished in a fireball so profound the Thunderhawk banking above shuddered violently. Lasfare lanced downwards, shearing through tracks, perforating engines. The silhouettes flared impossibly bright like pale dawns before collapsing into pyres. Azrael's own momentum never slowed. His speartip land raiders bypassed the carnage, plowing through undefended territory like vengeful avatars of ruin. The quarry, traitors fleeing the tightening jaws, became ragged panic streams funneling towards the dubious safety of the starport's bulk. Supreme Grand Master Azrael orchestrated the closing fist, his vehicles snaking through the periphery roads, surrounding the immense complex infantry squads deploying to sever escape routes. Outside the giant Ferrocrete bays, amidst Manufactorum debris, the iron noose drew untouchably tight. Vindicators lumbered forward, monstrous siege engines designed solely for obliteration. Their deafening demolishers spoke first, flooding defensive barricades built between crumbling warehouse stacks with dense, annihilating shockwaves that liquefied bodies and shredded masonry. Razorbacks disgorged tactical squads directly into those clouds of pulverized stone. Bolters barked rhythmic death as they methodically cleared cover, alley by corpse-strewn alley. Above, Thunderhawks returned, plowing furrows of missile impacts and cannon fire across troop concentrations revealed by darting Ravenwing speeders, their locations relayed instantly. Whirlwinds, momentarily silent predators, waited for targeting data. When it flowed in, their barrage began an apocalyptic metronome of high-explosive shells arcing into the sky before plunging into defensive holds, collapsing fortified positions, and reducing reserves to crimson mist. Strategy became relentless pressure. Under the veil of these concussive hammer blows the staccato thunder of bolters, the deep crump-crump-crump of demolisher fire, the high-pitched shriek of incoming artillery, the banshee wail of strafing, jets the defenders disintegrated into atomized pockets of desperate, disorganized fury. Coherence died under ceaseless, grinding application of overwhelming power. Dawn failed to pierce the permanent pall of smoke and ash enshrouding the starport. Became a place dominated by ruin and the deep, grinding crunch of armored tracks advancing over rubble. Azrael, relentless, pressed through smoke-choked streets no wider than ravines gouged through buildings reduced to skeletal ferrocrete frames, the hollow maws of broken windows weeping cables like intestines. By the pitiless ghostlight of glowing fires, his lines reached the scarred plains of the northern landing fields, the vast ferrocrete runways fissured and cratered by bombardment. The remaining defenders, compressed into a mutating core around the hangars and central command spires, turned these edifices of flight into brooding fortresses, burning buildings blazing like monstrous torches. Their defiance held a corner rednimal keen. Ghastly flares of promethium and the building-shaking thump of explosives marked the renewed assault the following dawn. Probing patrols of devastators and tactical marines tested the enemy perimeter. Discipline collided with desperate rage. Isolated counterattacks manifested frenzied charges fueled by stims and despair erupting from shattered doorways or collapsing roof lines. They were futile. Whirling chains, disciplined bolter volleys scythed them down, each such eruption met by an avalanche of Astartes' firepower. Overhead, assassination runs continued. Thunderhawks screamed down from the coppery sky, pouring death into any concentration large enough to register. The Supreme Grandmaster, the chessmaster in the slaughterhouse, withheld his absolute might. He saw beyond conquest. Annihilation demanded passing the prey into inevitable death. Small outriders were allowed to slip through the tightening cordon, bearing panicked vox signals summoning every desperate heretic within miles to the pyre poised under the immense heel of the Dark Angels. The third sun illuminated the critical grip. The noose was final. Enemy holding areas had shrunk to a tortured core. Azrael unleashed righteous fury, ancient oaths. The Sixth Company surged forward, led by the terrifying shadow of Interrogator Chaplain Baylor, his face a grim death mask, the sermon emanating from his vox scroll, a basso profundo hymn to oblivion. Before him strode veteran Brother Anmiel, bearing aloft the chapter's most sacred relic, the standard of devastation. Its fabric, impossibly ancient, hung heavy with divine sigils worked in sacred silver thread, yet darkened and stiff with the encrusted blood of legendary brothers fallen in past glories. The impact was visceral. Militia crumpled before its baleful presence, fleeting courage extinguished. Where resistance solidified, holy flames roared forth from heavy flamers held by salamander veterans, liquid promethium dousing choke points, incinerating defenders wholesale, the chemical tang sharp over the sickly roasted meat stench. Through the collapsing infrastructure, through superheated corridors paved with carbonized bones and molten steel, the 6th advanced in grim silence, broken only by the whump of flames and crack of bolter fire. By the hellish glow of cities burning, by the flicker warping the ancient banner's image, the southern sectors were declared purged. Yet the cost 15 brothers returned to the rock shrouded in silence, cast a deeper chill than the surrounding ruins. Day 4 sharpened the focus like a whetstone drawn down Azrael's blade. First Corps efficiency became terrifying reality. Coordinated strikes from all compass points turned the starport's heart into a tightening vortex of annihilation. Tactical, devastator, even assault elements blended their terrible crafts. East, south, west, the heresy-infested zones contracted block by sanguinary block into an ever-shrinking ring, choked by thick ash and streams of chaotic humanity running for illusory shelter. Streets degenerated into labyrinths through carnage, the stench of decay thickening daily despite the fires. Cornered, infused with frenzied courage born of terminal despair, the remnants fought like demon-possessed, tooth and nail bolter slugs slamming into ceramite with hollow clangs. Jury-rigged demolition charges detonated in confined spaces, screaming tons of slag downwards. Fierce, yes, futile utterly, only delaying the certain end. Amidst this maelstrom, slicing through frantic vox traffic laden with static and panic, came a pulse of pure ice from the 3rd Company holding a western ingress. Alpha Legion sighted, elite traitor Astartes, enemy armor pattern verified, faithless sigils detected. The hunt beneath the hunt had indisputable confirmation. They were here. For Azrael's tactical brilliance and obsessed persecution burned a hole deeper than vengeance. This became consecrated ground. The 8th Dawn saw resolution etched onto the rock face of every battle brother's expression. Azrael was finished waiting. 5 companies, a focused distillation of the chapter's martial fury, converged on the central ramparts. The Supreme Grandmaster emerged from the Thunderhawk Storm's arc, trod the scorched earth personally, his towering form unmistakable, sword of secrets shimmering with deadly intent like a sliver of moonlight captured from the abyss. Advancing berths became killing grounds. Elite vanguard terminators beside tactical discipline shattered militia lines. Victory fell like a physical weight upon the remaining defenders as Azrael carved through gibbering cultists armored in flakboard and prayer sheets like a resharpened scythe through rotten wheat. The bodyguards protecting a final redoubt crumpled. Heretic officers fell choking on their last garbled prayers. Then, from the ruins, from the deep shadows beneath buckled gantries, inside crumbling transitube tunnels, they surged. Alpha Legionnaires. Ancient power armor gleamed like polished venom scales, crawling with blasphemous sigils expressing mocking devotion to entities whose names curdled sane thought teleport flares. Heavy bolter fire erupted from unexpected vectors, ripping through the Astartes' advance like artillery on point-blank victims' unfolded traps. Concussive crack grenades, shredded cover spots Azrael's warriors absorbed ordered to shield their chapter leadership flowing currents. Chain axes howled, matching chainsword teeth screaming harmony to death. The disciplined ranks buckled ambush perfected, velocity. Precision punishment born thousands wars, mountain warfare methods, designed fracture core armies, lay exposed momentarily. Azrael saw Anmil stagger, Boltron slamming sickeningly into his chest. The beautiful ancient intricate pattern holy banner, he bore twisting slipping fingers him arc, agony graceful horrifying, billowed dust stained blood, slammed earth sight punctured ball deep beneath skin pride, forged millennia crack, physical wounds entire network really priest commands losses, sudden defect deployment impossible unit cohesion collapse hunger triumph. Fell roaring Azrael moved instinct cultivated predator speeds, surging vortex fighting tunnel vision raw razor wire brightest. Exploding braziers chaos warrior, heavies interposed chaos emparred blades, screeching deflected belly kings, unforgiving hate lightning sword of secrets, slammed shell of cordite ancient steel deflected clang rang tower plaza sent shockwave tremble stones foundations. Parry, riposte, counter riposte, leg sweep, headshot whipcrack chains spurting internal bile. Steel bit ceramite showered sparks visible the acrid smoke sown deeper, cuts into Lord's skin rockcrete wounds. Where dark armor breached rings, thick metallic echo cry recognizing redundant weapon blow exerted pressure, driving Grandmaster backwards reverberating bone, was narrow desperate raw flurry impossible block numbing force agony dazed head ringing, punishing ground faceplate impacted stone sword skittering inches, reach unavoidable finality arcing blade. descending judgment salvation detonation. Rounds tore heaven's daylight above swirling vortex ash reminiscent collapsing causeway. Terminator plate. Glowing Imperial Aquila marking revered purity darkest green. Baylor. Deathwing materializing smoke trails divine retribution heavy's assault cannons hymned utter annihilation decimating fire caused sealed armored enemies secondary concussions. Baylor's Gorslick Crozius swung thunderclap, connecting armor-ruined helm rocked skull within cratering skipped like stone touch agonies shuddering silver. Chaplain pivoted finish blow settled failed velocity, realign impossible evaporated crawling depths, smoking wreckage nearby buildings, mocking silence bastards, infect reality profoundest breaches tattered banners commanded living embodiment chapter honor regained holding. Aloft visual beacon rekindled determination shredded forces cohesive fury regrouped streamered spiritual matter condensed duty stain earth cleansed promethium immolated. Breach secured. Internal fortifications cracked. Concourse stormed. Final shelters breached with meltacharges blasting thirdaton adamantine blast doors, intact minutes thermal bloom, igniting precisely executed executions, conducted jellied precision. Alpha Legion Shadow had sunk beneath invaded fortress cores, machinery engineering remains, looted precious genes, samples salvaged before ignition sequence brand, simultaneously, ignited burned unrecoverable days ritual cleansing system. Void toxins unleashed architects, despair days, physical structures collapse core deliberately destabilized shattered monuments, hubris fractured continent spewed choking poison, sunlight failing penetrate scaled hull chapter thunderhawks depart. Carcass expanse lessons, written plasma fires consuming history's long dead failed armies, gasping weapons, silent crucified ruin tactivus ratio, verified continuous loss chaotic factions, pocketed reduced effectiveness corridor reinforcements able catechizing strangles preventing redisposition, critical frontlines, loyalist regained initiative elsewhere silent actions, orchestrated theurgical precision, secured endless war effort unknowingly bought. Deep beneath bedrock strata fortress worlds bearing terra, sanctified name nameless gray-faced figure historian gal, set trembling quill meticulously copied official panuman transcript side finally translation, mathematically accurate physically exhausting skull, pounded uncleanly residual data overload rising stiffly polished wooden cane leverage prepared essential recaf kept processing furious ritual congregation poured glassware brushed deep stains symbolic sacrifice ingested calming compounds undeniable ticking chronometer inexorable progress deeper archives seeking papers trails fade eternal sunset soft susurrus data intoxicant cooling forgotten tales like cooling sword returned sheath awaiting bloodshed assured renewed commemorated sacrifices enduring immortal patience. As Gale waited for the recaf to steep, its dark surface catching the dim light, he turned to the cramped shelves lining the refectory wall. From the meager selection, a simple bowl and a ladle of thin, steaming broth filled with anonymous grains and pale root vegetables, came forth the unadorned sustenance marking his place among the Imperium's servants. Its faint, earthy aroma offered a whisper of warmth as he balanced the bowl and mug carefully in his worn hands, moving towards a battered high-backed chair set against the stone wall. Setting his modest meal on the small table, his fingers brushed the cracked leather spine of a nearby tome, The Black Crusades, Chronicles of the Despoiler. Ancient leather creaked in protest as he opened it, releasing a cloud of dust that danced in the still air, tickling his nostrils. Gale ate mechanically, spoon dipping into the cooling broth with a hollow echo, while his hungry eyes devoured the inked horrors upon the parchment. The word summoned spectral legions, the thunderous fall of Cadia, the galaxy-daring scar of the Great Rift, the crushing tragedy of consumed worlds, and the flickering defiance of the Astra Militarum, steeped in despair. His gaze lingered on a faded illumination Akkadian soldier, face etched with ruin, standing amidst the skeletal remnants of her home. A low, reverent prayer for her sacrifice, and for all the countless souls obliterated in humanity's grimmest hours, escaped his lips. The recaf in his mug lay cold and forgotten, the broth untouched, his mind lost in 1,000 nightmare landscapes. Outside, the ceaseless, low hum of Sanctum Historica Tur seemed the very breath of the throne world vibrating through the stones. With slow care, he shut the book, the lamenting creak sharp in the stillness, sliding it back onto the shelf. He reached up, tapping the suspensor globe above his chair, instantly plunging the alcove into deep shadow. Gale crossed to his bare sleeping cell, its Spartan furnishings a stark testament to enduring servitude. The cot's surface felt unyielding against his frame, the thin blanket a feeble barrier against the chill, yet long years had hardened him to such austerity. Lying beneath it, his mind remained turbulent ocean of ancient pain, the despoiler's brutal fury, washing against the unbreakable rock of impossible human endurance. A final rasping prayer, broken and weary, escaped him in the thick darkness before his eyes closed, surrendering swiftly to a sleep as deep and encompassing as the void beyond Tur's walls.